Good evening. I'm Eric Greenberg, Chair of the FY24 CA Board of Directors. Please remember that this work session is being live streamed. You can find the agendas and background materials for this evening on the CA Board of Directors webpage. Links to these documents can also be found in the description section of our YouTube live stream for those watching the work session there. If you are virtual, please mute your microphones unless speaking. If you're in the room, please ensure that all cell phones are silenced. Raise your hand to speak and I'll record the names in the order which I see them. If you're virtual, please raise your hand. As we move through the work session, I will introduce each item on the agenda. Before a vote is taken, I will restate the motion as well as who motioned and seconded. If at any point you have trouble hearing me or any member present, please say so. Tonight's timekeeper is Sky Anderson. I will now call the roll. Sky?
Here.
Dietrich? Reg?
Here.
Karen?
Here.
Chris.
Present.
Alan?
Here.
Dennis?
Here.
Keith?
Here.
Bill?
Here.
Andy?
Here.
And I am here. May I have a motion to approve the agenda?
Move we approve the agenda.
Is there a second?
Yes.
Are there any objections to the agenda? Seeing no objections, the agenda is approved by unanimous consent. We will now move on to resident speak out. Speakers will be asked to speak in the order in which they signed up. Individuals have 3 minutes for comment. Anyone representing an organization has 5 minutes. Following remarks, the board will have a chance to ask questions. Please mute your microphones when you're not speaking. We will ask the speakers to adhere to the 3 or 5 minute time limit when presenting their testimony and for board members to limit questions in order to stay within the allotted time period. Our first speaker is Dara Baker.
Hi, everyone.
Hey.
Happy to see you. Happy New Year. My name is Dara Baker. I am a resident of Longreach, and I should be familiar to everyone. I am also a member of Protect Our Streams. I don't have any notes this time because I feel like this is the same reason I've been up here for about 2.5 years. I was getting myself ready to speak tonight, and I realized I've just reached the point that I am so incredibly frustrated. I am here speaking in support of a reasonable, responsible change to the easement policy, something that I have been noted and mentioned since the first time that I was before this board, basically trying to point out all of the flaws and the failures with the now defunct, hopefully, Lake Elkhorn project. From the very beginning, I had questions about how that easement was granted. I had questions for the general counsel at that point, which we never got answers to, about what the limitations of that were, what rights the board and us as residents had for the property that basically been given over without a permit to a company that now made it clear that they weren't going to be able to do that project. And we, as regular members of the public who educated ourselves on the science associated with this project, proved was never going to work. I can't basically fathom for myself why this board would be resistant to implementing a reasonable policy that would protect not only us as residents, and we elect you to this position in order to protect us, just like people elect members to Congress. It is all of us coming up on a repeated basis telling you that we have deep concerns about how this board is treating the property that you are responsible for, how it is treating the residents who come to speak to you, how it is treating us as the representatives of the group that we are part of, and how it is that you are treating us with the 2.5 years of knowledge and experience that we've been building. I think that it is something that this board should do, that we pointed out at the very beginning that it was 11 minutes for this 130,000 acre 6 mile project, that it was treated like every other small easement that is given. I'm pretty sure I came up to this board probably 4 or 6 months ago and suggested a change to the policy, that there is more information provided to the board for any easement over an acre, that you take reasonable time to do that, that there's transparency for the public for the actions that you're taking. We've made it clear that there is a cost involved for these things. It is land that is so unusual to find. And I really hope that this board backs away from the edge of cowardice and really embraces the fact that it's their responsibility for all of us and for our future. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any questions? Alan.
Yeah, a couple of questions. Could you, you used the phrase, there's a cost involved. Was that a cost to the land? Was that a cost to the organization? Or was that a cost to the person who wants the easement? What did you mean by a cost involved?
Well, there are all kinds of, it's a combination between sunk costs and also my time and my energy and your time and your energy. I mean, the
And
amount of,
how would you want to see that represented in a policy?
I would love to see a policy if the amount of time and energy that is spent in terms of investigating it, I would like a return on investment for what we're actually expecting rather than what we're just, openly promised with no actual monetary or other analysis. I would really love to see the independent review that we have proposed of, what the cost of making that land available and what happens if something like this happens where the vendor is pulled out and it's clear that nobody knows what to do now.
Good, thank you.
Bill?
Yeah. Hi, good evening, Darren. Thank you for your testimony, and I appreciate and respect the point of view that you have with relation to the Lake Elkhorn project. You had mentioned a limitation of projects over an acre. As we have these discussions, do you think that's a valid limitation that should apply to the easement policy going forward? And do you think of any other limitations that maybe would be beneficial for us to consider?
I have thought about it. When I came up with that size, there are obviously certain projects that are undertaken here in CA, particularly associated with tot lots or something associated with a small project that having the investment in doing that type of analysis may not be beneficial. I think maybe one of the things that should be considered in light of everything that has been going on is that we bring somebody on board who can give us a strategic view of, with the amount of land that CA has to manage, what is that number? Obviously, 6 miles and 130,000 acres probably is much bigger than it should be. There might be a point at which we have a couple of different levels where anything over an acre gets, a 1 day analysis. Anything that is 10 acres or over gets a different level of analysis. I think that's something that is a reasonable question, is something that should be considered.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Karen?
So when you say the analysis, would you expect staff to do that analysis, or would you want an independent expert to do that analysis?
I would prefer an independent expert with input from probably a staff member and somebody who may not have been here for a very long time.
And can I have a follow-up also? And you talked about transparency. So what would the residents like when it comes to transparency? How would you have preferred this project go before the easement was granted?
So I think from the very beginning, one of the things that caught our attention, I live 20 feet from the edge of what would have needed approval from a resident. And so I'm living in King Charles Commons. We were supposed to be one of the communities that was consulted and had to give our approval for the project. There was a letter sent to the treasurer of our HOA in December of 2020 that nobody paid any attention to. And no one sort of brought it to our attention from the Long Reach board or from the CA board. It would have been a problem for the project to begin with because our board never gave approval for that. And they were the landowner. But living 20 feet away from what would have been a massive construction project with bulldozers, it was no level of transparency. I think that anyone who is going to be in range of the noise, the disruption, et cetera, I think that CA should be doing not just the letter of what is absolutely required, but take into consideration the fact that we are supposed to be a community and working together. Not everyone is going to be the same, but for a lot of us, we are highly educated, we're professionals, we're people who take this seriously. A well thought out project, something better than a marketing plan, something that gives us a sense that we are going to be protected and protected, that our property is going to be protected, and our response back is not going to be, yeah, it'll be fine, don't worry about it. I think everybody here will say from the very beginning, one of my biggest issues is that this project was always looked through only through rosy glasses as if it was going to be 100% success. And I have yet to see any project involving construction that is guaranteed to be 100% success.
Thank you.
Any further questions? I do have one question. So you basically use an acre as sort of a dividing line between critical easements and non-critical easements, for lack of a better word. I question whether or not land size is the right metric, because you could have a small parcel of land that's very strategic for the organization that you would want to be in sort of that critical easement range, and you could have large parcels that may not be so strategic.
Is that a question?
What's your question?
So my question is, my question is, is land size the valid metric?
I would love the opportunity to investigate this more. Land size was one thing that I considered. Another thing to take into consideration is closeness to houses and to homes, closeness to schools. You could take into, another way that you would do it would be to develop a rubric of risk associated with it, which I think would be a very important one, not just to the environmental components, but also the human components and the long-term implications.
Thank you. Next, we have Amy Bennett.
I have some instructions here that haven't been here before, so I want to make sure I follow them. Okay, Amy Bennett, Village of Long Reach, lived in Columbia since its inception. That's the background. I'm here tonight to talk about the proposed easement policy and why it's so desperately needed. I just want to remind people, I'm going to read a letter from Columbia Association to the Maryland Department of the Environment and the U.S. Army Corps. And I'm going to tell you that this letter was allowed to go out under the current easement policy. That's how I'll start off. Okay, so the current easement policy allowed this letter to go out on behalf of Columbia Association, giving away 6 miles of up to 133 acres of mature forest. This is the part that I'm reading directly from CA's letter. Dear Ms. Bashir and Ms. Neff, Columbia Association is in full support of the Lake Elkhorn Stream Mitigation Bank proposed by Wetland Solutions. CA has provided WSSI with a contract granting exclusive rights to perform all work necessary to perform, permit, design, construct, and operate a stream mitigation bank on our property. Additionally, the CA Board of Directors passed a resolution on the 28th of January to grant WSSI an easement to establish and develop those stream mitigation. I still don't know the status of that easement, and I know I'm not allowed to ask the question. I hope a board member will ask at some point, what's the status of the easement that was given? Continuing with the letter. CA published the Watershed Management Plan dated 2009, which identified the need for stream restoration in the Lake Elkhorn watershed. I'm going to move on. I have copies of this letter. What I want to say is this letter is an embarrassment. It's not an argument. It's an embarrassment. And as someone who dealt with federal grants for 20 years, this would not have been accepted. Let me tell you what some of the implications are. The board passed the easement with no plan, just a promise. Based on a 2009 watershed plan, I guarantee you the industry has learned much in the 14 years since the recommendation was made. We've learned much about the destruction of stream restoration. I'm sorry about my voice, I have a condition. The current easement policy is also very old.
So your time, can you make a final statement?
Yes, I can. The current easement plan is old and needs revision. What is the role of the board with regard to oversight of our open space?
Thank you. Do you have any questions?
I do have a copy of the letter. I know many of you have it. Would anybody like a copy?
Karen's got a
Yep, I want a copy, Amy, but I also have a question for you.
Sure.
So I guess I take it from what you're saying is you think that the process is backwards.
Oh, absolutely. There's no resident input. There's no... If we hadn't asked MDE for a public hearing, this project would have moved forward. My backyard, I would have lost $20,000 right away because you were taking 50 feet of my forest. Now, of course, it's not mine. But anyway, no, it's about letting people know what you're doing, why you're doing it, that it's a benefit to the community, not 10 million, somebody gives you $10 million and you take it. And it wasn't, Dennis, 2 trees and a bush.
Raj?
No, I was asking for a comment.
Oh, okay. I thought you were
Thank you,
asking a
Amy.
question. Any other questions?
Thanks, Sam.
Actually, you can just,
Hey, Amy?
you can just leave the stack here. I'll
Just
I'll just take a stack, I'll hand them out.
That's fine. I had a question for you.
Oh.
I can get you back on the mic there. And just, if you leave them with staff, we'll
Bill.
get the letter for sure. Yeah. Thank you for your comments about the easement related to Lake Elkhorn. I was wondering if there are any other easements that have been passed in the last 2 years that you took exception to, that you thought were handled poorly?
I think you're going to hear from other speakers about other examples, evidence of why we need this new policy.
All right. But you're aware of just one, is that correct?
No, but I'm not going to share, I'm not going to take other people's time.
Understood. Thank you.
Actually, if you want to leave the copies here, I can distribute them. If you,
This is mine, and
Okay.
it's all scribbled.
okay.
But I can send it to
Here you go.
Alan?
One last question.
Alan.
You said we need a new policy, but you sort of ran out of time in terms of what that policy would be. So could you say 1 or 2 sort of high-level things that you want to make sure a new policy has?
Well, I think that the number one issue for me, well, there are 2 main issues. One, I'm a lien payer and a citizen, and my home was going to be directly impacted. You must talk to me. I tried my village, I tried CA, I tried the board, and finally I went to MVP. And they told me to ask for a public hearing. And that's what I did.
Thank you. Next, we have Dan Hodgdo. Dan? Are you on,
He's not.
is he virtual?
No.
Okay. Next, we have Ginny Thomas.
Who?
Hi, Virginia Thomas from Oklahoma.
Oh, Virginia.
Welcome back.
I'll sit up straight.
Okay, great, thank you. This is cutting 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
She should have 3 minutes.
You only get
You get 3. She gets 3.
Okay,
Go for it.
Thank you. When I first became a CA board member, I believed that the easement policy protected one of our most valuable assets, open space. I would like to remind the board that in every resident satisfactory survey, open space was the top priority. In my second year, it became clear to me that the easement policy does not protect all of our open space. In the state legislature, we would refer to the policy that you have now as an easement policy as something you could drive a Mack truck through. I also believe that the residents would be heard at a public hearing of the board on each easement regarding the requested use by a profit organization on CA open space. I learned that the new staff found a way not to go through the public process by calling a request in, for example, Symphony Woods, a settlement and a license. In fact, after several months of not having access to that contract deal, license, settlement, the Attorney General had to instruct CA staff that they had to share the results with the public. There was no appraisal on the land. Down at the lakefront, the process was again ignored in favor of a contract to a profit organization. For 6 months, I have been trying to get the status report on that property and a date for an easement public hearing by the CA board. Finally, when I asked again in March 2023, that I learned that a contract was signed by CA staff with a profit group December 2022. Again, no appraisal of the land. The public had a right to see the contract. They had to ask for it. So again, it wasn't shown right away. Another example, when a question was asked about how much profit a company would pay for an easement near Whole Foods, the board was told that the company would tell CA what they were going to pay. Several other examples, I asked to put conditions on the easement, but I was told we couldn't do that on the policy that we were voting on, but the staff would put some of it in a contract. Of course, we never saw the contract. And I do have a good example here, Dennis, on a positive note, but I don't know if I'm going to get to this about something you did. In fact, our residents can't submit an application for simple changes to their property without completing an extensive report with pictures to the architectural committee in their village. Why do we require less from profit organizations on our open space? Why does the staff submit a proposal without more information in it than is required of a resident simply asking to paint their door? Why don't we require any transfer of use of CA open space for more than 3 days to a profit organization that it should require a public hearing by the CA board?
Tom, can you make a phone?
Dennis, I'm sorry, I'll send you the positive about what you did with King's Contrivance. That was a winner.
Ginny, my question is, can you tell Dennis what he did positive?
I don't remember. Yes, the easement, and it came to the board. It was a public hearing, which is the point I'm making. And it was a developer on Guilford Road across from the village center. I think he had tried for 55 plus, whatever. But he needed to meet a requirement by the county to have a connection to a path, and that meant some CA land. And Dennis came in, he negotiated it, and the developer told him basically, this is blackmail. I'm a developer in the county for a long time. I am not going to cooperate with your request and what turned out to be the board's request. So we backed that to actually put his homes in the CA lien process, which is great. I see it as a real victory, and I really think the reason that happened is that it was a public process. So thank you, Dennis.
Thank you.
And thank you, board members, for doing that.
Thank you. Do we have any other? Bill?
Hey, Ginny, good evening. Good to see you.
Good evening, Bill.
All right,
I'll see you at Starbucks Sunday.
that'd be fantastic. I'd love to. Actually, we're at Whole Foods right now because it's cold outside.
Oh, Whole Foods, I'm sorry I mentioned them in here.
That's, I just have coffee there. I'm not a stockholder or anything. I had a question for you. With respect to the Lake Elkhorn project, you were one of the members that voted on that easement. You were the ones that debated for 11 minutes on that. Could you
Yes.
give me some characteristics as to why that went so quickly and there wasn't any additional follow-on or additional controls that the CA board did not provide for that?
Yeah.
What actually went down with that easement? I'd like to know.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I was a new board member, and there was a lot of trust in the staff that they knew what they were doing, and the big selling point was, wow, we do this, we're going to save a lot of money, and, you know, it's a win-win for everybody. At that time, I didn't realize all that really should have been in any application, which is what I'm pushing for now, before it even comes to the board. It was frankly inexcusable that the board didn't have all the information and didn't realize it didn't have it, but believe me, I learned a lesson, and I started, as you know, Brian Woods Childcare is an example where I was putting conditions on some of the easements we got. So that's it, and no excuse though for Longfellow either, where I think the board should have taken, the staff should have taken action to inform the board, but it never should have come to us without all the information available and resident input. Resident input is so important. It's being ignored with these licenses, settlements, contracts. This is your sacred open space. You're stewards for this land. You need to begin to act like you're stewards. So you've got to change this policy.
Alan?
Sorry, I'll get off the soapbox.
No.
As a longtime resident, as someone who's been active as a former board member, is it clear to you what differentiates a situation that requires a contract, a lease, a land swap, or an easement? Are those distinctions clear to you?
Yeah, they're all a mistake. It should be an easement. It should come under the category of anybody that's going to get use of our open space, your open space, which is really valued by the residents and should be valued by us. should come to a public meeting. You can call it anything you want. You want to call it a contract, I don't care. You want to call it a license, I don't care. But the idea is it has to come to you with all the specifics like you do for an architectural thing before your village board. You wouldn't be able to be heard. It is in a public meeting at the village board level for an architectural thing. They won't even hear it unless you have all of it. This board cannot continue to just start hearing things without all of the information. And the information that's required under the easement policy is pathetic. It's in the best interest of the people of Columbia. Really? In whose view? You know, a few more specifics maybe. So I don't care what you call it, a gift, contract, settlement, whatever.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's not the issue.
Thank you. Any further questions? Thank you.
Thank you guys, have fun.
Next, we have Dick Bolton.
Well done.
Is he online?
No, I don't see, no, I don't see.
Next, we have Bob Dover.
Hi, folks.
Good afternoon.
I'm speaking tonight in favor of reviewing and updating the CA procedures for considering and approving easements. I spent most of my 30-year environmental consulting career evaluating applications for easements on land managed by the Federal Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, and U.S. Forest Service. This is what I spent my career on. For evaluating applications for those easements, those agencies have standard procedures designed to ensure that no rights are granted to for-profit companies until the applicant has provided enough detailed information for the agency, that's you, to determine that the proposed activities are technically sound and based in the most recent science. The impacts of the proposed activities on ecology and adjacent properties are avoided and mitigated. And the financial value of the grant benefits the taxpayers on the land. When I first reviewed the Elkhorn Branch prospectus, I had a difficult time understanding that CA had already granted the easement for that project before the extended disturbance and the tree removal was finalized, before the residents had had a chance to understand the impacts on their properties, and before applications for environmental permits had been completed. This is the exact opposite of how federal land management agencies process these requests. I also did not understand and still do not understand the logic behind granting a 130-acre easement for a 60-acre project. If the developer is not permitted to enter and disturb the additional 70 acres, why have they been granted an easement to land area that they admit they don't need? BLM will not give the developer 1 square inch more than they can demonstrate their need for. The process that was used by CA to grant the easement for Elkhorn makes no sense for an agency that presumably wishes to fully understand the benefits and impacts of a project before they approve it. After seeing how the Elkhorn assessment process played out, it's clear that a revision of the current policy is necessary to ensure that any private company wishing to use CA land for their own profit must specifically and explicitly define what they intend to do and fully inform all potentially affected property owners before they're granted any rights. So I'm going to take a minute to respond to some of the questions that were asked of Dara about what the policy should include. If it was done wrong before, what should it include? And the answer is, you don't have to invent this from scratch. The federal land management agencies already do this, and they've been doing it for decades. I'm sure the state agencies also do the same thing. It's just CA that hasn't caught up and figured out how to do this. BLM knows. The answer is there's not a single acreage line where you have to do it or don't do it. The question is impacts. The question is, it comes to be a little bit of a subjective judgment, but other agencies have done this. Talk to those agencies. Thanks.
Thank you. Do you have any questions? Alan?
I thought I heard you say, and I want to make sure I didn't mishear you, that the easement shouldn't be given until after there's been some land disturbance.
No.
Were you saying the opposite?
No, it shouldn't be given until they define the amount of land disturbance they're going to do and tree removal they're going to do.
That's what I thought you would say, but I thought I heard the opposite, so I wanted to
Okay.
make sure. Thank you.
Bill?
Yep. At the top of your, good evening, Bob, good to see you. At the top of your remarks, it seemed like you had listed or enumerated some clearly defined criteria that Bureau of Land Management had used to evaluate easements. Do you believe that any policy that we have should have a clear statement of criteria in which we're going to evaluate easements? What's the importance that you would place on having that in any policy that we had?
Like Jenny said, if you don't define certain standards, then it becomes a matter of interpretation and people can drive a truck through it, people can abuse it, which is why BLM and Forest Service ended up developing the policies they have now. They're pretty detailed, and I understand that it may seem like, well, they're big agencies, they can do that, and you're a small agency, you really can't. But, yeah, there's already information out there, and if you don't define certain things like that, then it's going to get abused, which, it has been in those other agencies.
So, yes? Would you agree with my statement that criteria would be important?
I think the criteria are important, yes.
Okay. Quick follow-up. You're talking about Bureau of Land Management. I'm familiar with the Forestry Service and their limits of acceptable change process. Are you at all familiar with that?
I've been involved in evaluating not acceptable change from a climate change standpoint.
Right.
It's more from a impacts
Yes, yeah.
standpoint. Yes.
I think that would be great if we analyzed that. Would you agree with that?
I would. There is a NEPA component to what you guys are doing on the stream restoration projects. It's the Corps of Engineers has the NWP 27 permit, and they actually do specify criteria for what needs to be in those applications. The problem is that the Elkhorn application didn't have that stuff in it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Thank you. Next, we have Pearl Atkinson Stewart. Pearl online?
No, I don't see her.
Next, we have,
Oh, there she
oh, she is?
There she is.
I see a Pearl Atkinson Stewart.
Pearl, can you hear us?
Pearl?
She's an attendee.
How did we just lose her?
She's gone now.
Does she need to be,
Just dropped off.
what?
Yep, she just came on.
She can,
I'm still here,
There she is.
Hi.
yeah, we can hear you.
but I don't see, well, all right, here, I see you now. Okay, now, so, you're hearing me now.
We can hear you.
Okay, good evening. I'm
evening.
Pearl Atkinson Stewart from the Village of Owen Brown. Last year, I spoke at Resident Speak Out to inform you of blatant non-compliance by the CA Standing Committee. This committee ignored all HOA, CA, and Robert's rules. The board investigated my allegations and found that they were confirmed. The board chair assured me that actions would be taken to correct these violations. On January 2024, 4 months after I informed CA of these violations, I was informed that the remedy for the violations was to remove all policies relating to Robert's Rules and HOA. The offending committee was not reprimanded for their violations, but were rewarded for bad behavior and given more power to not be transparent and inclusive. In fact, gave permission for them to not have any stated structure for meetings by removing a 30-year existing charter for this committee that used Robert's Rules all those years. What has become of CA? We are a public corporation. We are a homeowners association. How can the acting president advise the committees of the board or the staff to remove Robert's Rules from their charters? All CA charters historically contained a standard inclusion in all their charters since Jim Rouse had it inserted in the original CA charter and corporation. It should remain as standard parliamentary procedures. I was told that the acting president announced that he will retire in May 2024. But he encouraged the CA board to turn complete control of all CA committees, including the board's standing committees, over to him. The CA board did so. The acting president has served 40 years under the Jim Rouse adopted parliamentary procedures, and only after a complaint is registered, he determined to eliminate all parliamentary procedures previously adopted and contained in all CA committee charters. How can the CA board condone removal of all adopted policies? The CA board allowed a major structure change of the corporation.
Your time, can you make a final statement, please? Your time, can you please make a final statement?
Yes, I would request that CA reinstate Robert's rules and HOA rules to all the committee charters as it was previously done.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Alan?
Yeah, hi, Pearl, Alan Klein. One of the reasons, or the reason the change was made was that the committees no longer are board advisory committees, but they are staff advisory committees. Would you, in addition to wanting to see things like Robert's Rules reinstated, would you want those committees to go back to being board advisory committees?
I don't think it makes any difference because even the staff committee charters were drafted with that same language in there that they were to use the parliamentary procedures. And to answer your question, I think that, the board has already stated that they did not have the time to do this. So I would leave that up to your ability to have the time. I mean, when I was on the CA board, we made the time. So,
Great.
As I said, this is a new day and you all have different things. So I would leave that up to the committee. But I think it was working. It was working pretty well. And I don't see why we made the change in the first place. But as I said.
Thank you, Pearl.
Thank you. Bill?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to go on record that I have never said that I didn't have time for the community or residents. That never came from my position or my mouth.
Do you have a question?
So I don't, but I want to be on record about that.
I think that's true of many of us.
Any other questions? Thank you for your testimony. Next we have Sue Bannister.
She's on.
She should. Sue, are you out there?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Can you see me?
No.
No, we can hear you.
Okay, I should be
Now we
on
can see you.
video.
No, that's Sky.
I don't.
Sky.
Sky.
Got a good Sky mask on.
Can you see me yet?
There you go.
We see you, Sue.
Anyway, it's good to be here tonight, and wonderful to hear from all the people that we've heard from tonight. It's just been a really informative and valuable session so far. I really appreciate the work of the board on addressing the much-needed improvements to CA's policy on easements. And particular thanks to Karen Emery for taking the initiative and providing a very fine draft. As our volunteer board members, you are Columbia residents and you represent our residents without compensation. Your mission, as given by CA, is to act in your official capacity exclusively for the social welfare and civic betterment of our communities, a worthy vision, though not always easy. In the relationships among board and staff and residents, an important component is an element of trust. This is not blind trust, but rather trust based on accountability. And accountability requires a hefty amount of willing and honest transparency among all three groups, staff to board, board to residents, and residents to their representatives. Although this trust may have been frayed following the Longfellow and Lake Elkhorn projects, it can and must be restored for the continuing health of the community. I believe that improving the granting of easement policy is an important step in that direction. Conversely, the alteration of committee policies, as mentioned by Pearl just now, is likely to have the opposite effect, increasing distrust by decreasing transparency. I believe this stronger, more specific, more thorough, and transparent easement policy will give residents, including the board, more confidence and security regarding decision-making about the most highly valued and most singular asset of Columbia, our open space. Frankly, the previous policy and procedure is alarmingly vague, with little objective guidance for making clear determinations and few actual requirements. In practice, its flaws became obvious when questions were raised during the recent case of Lake Elkhorn. There were few specifics available regarding the basis for the decision to award this easement. Specifics such as why it required such an unusually large area, what the monetary value of the easement was, what negative impacts residents would experience, how much tree removal would occur, what was the likelihood of success by what measurements, what would invalidate the conveyance of the easement, how can we revoke the easement to get it back, and more. Legitimate questions from stakeholders that either couldn't or wouldn't be answered. This vagueness and lack of transparency is a liability for Columbia Association and consequently for all of us. Please don't let this opportunity pass. And thank you for continuing to provide resident input, encouraging a healthy, active community.
Thank you. Do you have any questions? Thank you. Next, we have Richard Bannister.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm here to speak tonight because just over 3 years ago, January 28th, 2021, the board approved the easement of the Lake Elkhorn project in just over 3 minutes of friendly banter, putting their trust in the testimony of senior staff. Every single appearance I have made at Resident Speakouts since has been for the same reason. Every meeting I've been to for my village board or Protect Our Stream meetings has been for the same reason, because the board put their trust in testimony of staff alone, just the testimony of the staff. And putting their trust in the testimony of the staff back then was quite reasonable, right? I thought so. I thought it would be okay to put my trust in the testimony of the staff at the outset. However, it turned out my trust was misplaced. Even in that same meeting, in response to a question from Sherry Zaret, senior staff member Dennis Maddy made the false statement that there are some areas where the stream is really moving towards single-family residences. I and other residents have asked repeatedly for evidence of this and have received none. Zero, zip, nada. And I know why, because it simply isn't true. The closest residence to the stream is about 14 feet from the stream, which is the same distance it was when the residence was built. The stream has visibly not moved 50 years. Sherry also asked the question, quote, "We have always had a policy that if we take a tree out, we put two in. Is that still going to be in place for this project?" Dennis Maddy. So the answer is yes. It will be 2 for 1 replacement, yes. Now here's an example of what that means. It's like I have a $20 bill, which is a mature tree. I have a quarter, which is a sapling, which is what they would replace the tree with. A mature tree and sapling are both trees, and a $20 bill and a quarter are both monies. Now put that quarter into savings where it will accrue interest, eventually it will grow to become $20. So here, I'm happy to exchange not just 1 quarter for a $20 bill, but 2 quarters, which will eventually grow to be $40. Any takers? They're both monies. 2 for 1. What a deal. That's the kind of 2 for 1 replacement that was promised. And now 3 years on, how much coin has been spent on this boondoggle of a project? How much time and energy have staff, the board, and residents wasted on this project, which came to a whimpering end when the company, WSSI, for whom the easement was granted, pulled out? So yes, I'm here tonight because the board 3 years ago failed to ask the questions they didn't know they needed to ask. And it is my opinion that the easement policy draft put forward by Karen Emery
your time.
be given consideration to prevent another debacle like the Lake Elkhorn project from happening again. It was a total failure and waste of our time and fees.
Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Please ask me a question.
I think we're all questioned out, unfortunately. But thank you for your testimony. And it looks like there are no takers for the $20 bill exchange. Next, we have Sharon Boys representing Protect Our Streams. Okay.
And that is the easement on Lake Elk. Good evening, board members.
Good evening.
Thank you for your continued dedication to our community, and thank you for this opportunity. We've discussed a number of things recently: budget requests, the Longfellow debacle, the watershed management plan, the WAC committee and their new charter, including the big secret behind who wrote it, and what we should do with the $5 million surplus. Should it be spent on bonuses? If $2 to $10 million for administrative costs aren't enough, perhaps folks shouldn't work for a nonprofit. In your search for a new president, we hope you will choose a member from our community who exudes transparency and inclusion. Someone who is excited to work with the community, their neighbors, the elected board of directors, and the residents. Someone who is interested in what is on the residents' mind, for better or worse. Someone who wants to say hello to everyone who comes to a board meeting, and someone who wants to protect our streams and environment, our open space and quality of life, and our unique identity. My eyes were opened to our land use policy years ago. I don't expect folks to remember when there was a petting zoo in Symphony Woods, but take a look around. Come to Longfellow. What if I told you there was an out-of-state, for-profit corporation that wanted an easement for 133 acres in our open space, and with no true meaningful discussion with all the residents, this corporation would be allowed to remove all the trees and vegetation in 65 acres of forest. These are the actual figures, you guys. This forest is home to 215 species of birds and endangered species of bats that would lose their habitat. Hundreds of homes' views and microclimate would be altered forever. 6 miles of stream water could be degraded to the point where it could drastically alter the biology in the Columbia Lake. This work could impact the integrity of a high-hazard dam with a tremendous amount of people who live downstream. Whose insurance would cover that tragedy? This corporation would make untold millions of dollars in profits. They would not pay to dredge the lake, and in 10 years or less, they're going to walk away, and it will be up to CA to manage a 6-mile-long, 100-foot-wide swath of invasive species-filled land and angered and saddened residents. Wow, right? How would you handle that? Would you think that this was worthy of more than an 11-minute conversation that took place before the vote on the Lake Elkhorn easement? I'm sure you would, but the board members weren't told any of this. I have alone, not counting these folks, spoken to 3 boards in 5-minute increments, spending more than a dozen times that amount of time about that project, and I've barely scratched the surface. MDE issued an 11-page letter of concerns about that project that was withheld from the board. As of today, the contractor still holds the easements. Longfellow and Lake Elkhorn were shots across the bow. Unfortunately, Longfellow didn't know to duck, but we dodged the bullet on Lake Elkhorn, and it's time to take action to make sure we never grant another easement on our open space without due diligence, community engagement, adequate time for appraisals and research if needed, and meaningful comments and discussions ever again. Our open space is invaluable. We have a finite amount of land. I've asked over and over, how many acres are in an easement now, and how is CA financially benefiting from this? CA is supposed to be a nonprofit HOA, but many of us are beginning to question if some of these land use decisions could have an impact on our tax-exempt status with the IRS. If someone is making money from our open space, it's imperative that Columbia and her residents get a fair share. The only way to accomplish this is with an appraisal from an independent expert. If someone wants to perform work in a watershed, that is serious business and requires a true and financially independent watershed expert, not staff. The easement on Elkhorn states, this was for the promotion and social welfare of the people. to produce civic betterments or social improvements. Many in my neighborhood would strongly disagree. The new proposed land use policy will put common sense measures in place that ask you to stop and think a minute. It is a desperately needed, overdue layer of protection for CA, protection for the board, and protection for our irreplaceable open space. I'm asking you to please vote in favor of this policy when it comes up and in favor of our future generations of wildlife and people. Thank you for your time and for your vote to approve the policy.
Thank you. Do you have any questions? Reg?
Hey, Sharon, just got a question. You mentioned that we should have someone other than the staff provide that information. Why is that so?
Well, because the staff, for years, has insisted that the Longfellow project is a success. So they clearly are not qualified to make these decisions for our watersheds. The Long Reach project would have left a 100-foot wide scar, 50 feet of trees on either side of the stream, along the Elkhorn Branch Trail down to Lake Elkhorn. You've got to come on a stream walk with me. It's just hard to fathom that an expert in charge of overseeing our wooded stream corridors would think that that was an acceptable thing to do.
So what kind of expert would you?
There's watershed experts. There's one named John Fields who's in New England. I don't know him personally. I know of him. He could come down here and he could do an entire assessment of our watersheds. And I will say that John Fields is not totally like anti-stream restoration. I have seen projects where he has decided that a stream has been so degraded that perhaps a less intrusive method of stream restoration is the appropriate action, but he takes the whole watershed into account. He would be the one who would say how many rain gardens we would need, where we would need a bioretention, what BMPs have failed, where plantings could help, how much impervious surface needs to be removed. This is what he does for a living. And he would just be an independent expert. No financial ties at stake, no mitigation bank, no kickback from a restoration project. He would just come down here to do this as his job and make recommendations.
Okay, thank you.
John Fields.
And any other questions? Karen?
Yeah, so when we're talking about independent experts, I mean, I think you made the comment that the policy that I put out into the public would...
Which is fabulous, by the way. If anybody here has not read that, well, it didn't make it into the packet for some reason, but it was a very, very, very good policy.
Oh, thank you, Sharon. So when we're talking about experts, I also, one of the things I want to ask you is, do you think that that policy would also protect staff?
Yeah, absolutely, I think it'll protect staff. I think you guys are opening yourselves up here. You know, there's a case, Turner versus Mercado, that talks about when people live in an established, mature neighborhood, that they have a right to what that neighborhood should always look like. There's actually, particularly with covenants, this is all about a covenants case. But yeah, I think you're opening yourselves up to lawsuits. The board is responsible for the actions of CA. So if CA does something that decreases our property values or puts us in a situation saying, well, we're paying more utility bills because now we're living in a heat island, there could be consequences for those actions, for allowing these types of projects to go down without your due diligence and research. Absolutely.
Any other questions? I actually have one question. Outside of specific names, how should we go about finding independent experts?
Like I said, I know the one I haven't really looked into anymore. Certainly, I think you could do that on a Google search, but I'd also be happy to get a list together. There's some people in Virginia as well. I just know John Fields is really highly regarded, and this is quite a large area. So you would want to definitely make sure you had somebody who had done several of these types of projects of this size and could show you success from what they had done. So,
Thank you.
yeah. And one other thing I want to say real quick about that 1 acre size. I just want to kind of echo that when Darrell was asked about that, she did say that it really kind of did depend on the piece of land. I don't think you can really put a size on it, thinking about like the space down there at the lakefront in front of the restaurant and the 4th of July. And then also, what's that called, the little dog leg piece? And, you know, controversial easements, we've got Meriwether, we've got Longfellow, we've got Lake Elkhorn that's apparently still being held hostage for some reason. I mean, there really are many. Look at the lakefront. I mean, I really don't think
she's
that-
answered your question.
Yeah, she's out top.
Okay,
Yep,
thank you, Sky.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
Any,
All right.
thank you.
Thank you.
Last we have Joel Hurwitz. Joel, are you out there?
Yeah, I saw him listed.
Joel, can you hear us, or
There he is.
Here he is.
you're out there?
Just unmute.
Joel, are you on mute?
You had to make me a panelist.
Well, we can hear you now.
They just did that after you mentioned me, so that's the delay.
Go for it, Joel.
Joel, we can hear you. Go for it.
All right, good evening. Joel Hurwitz from Columbia, Vice Chair Harper's Choice, but speaking for myself. Regarding easement policies, rather than fix a policy, the first thing to answer Alan's earlier question, follow the charter. And I need to go back here. Hold on a second. In 2008, the Maryland Attorney General Consumer Protection Division sent a letter regarding violation of CA following its charter and granting of easements. They said that Maryland law has long recognized that the interest of land created by an easement can be monetarily valued and negotiated for sale and is therefore an asset, as the term is generally defined. This office therefore maintains its position that in order for CA to leave, sell, or donate easements to CA property, the board must first pass a resolution according to its charter and may not delegate the authority to CA's president, as it was doing from 2003. You now pass a resolution with the 3 things enumerated in the charter, which is partly because I complained about this after I learned of this letter a number of years ago. Problem was, as I read, it says leave, sell, or donate. And as Alan and Andy were involved at the time in 2015, I believe that leave was a typo because it's cross-referenced in other parts of the charter. But by motion by Alan and seconded by Andy, leave was deleted. So it just says sell or donate, which now has a problem of the leases, which is in part people have expressed concern about the long-term lease for the collective restaurant at the former Clyde's, which did not come before the board. So it's not just leases, it's other long-term things. But your charter already covers all this. If anything, the charter is too broad because it says that you cannot give away any assets, which doesn't be restricted to real property, but could also be interpreted to be anything from an old truck to giving away leftover tennis balls or pencils. So it needs to be done for any real property and any leases of probably more than a year or more. The development easement for the Inner Arbor is basically a way of getting around a fee simple donation or transfer. And with the county's recent things with the museum, they canceled their lease, but gave them a 6-month right of entry, which is basically a lease by another term. So you could also follow HOCO, Howard County's template for having meetings if you want to deal with how to deal with
Joel, you're out of time.
properties.
Can you make a final statement?
My final statement is that HOCO 4 was amended this morning based largely on my phone calls and help from my board, in case you want to deal with that later.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Alan?
Joel, could you be my memory for a moment and remind us why we chose to take out lease rather than change leave to lease?
I shared with you the transcript I made of that 2015 board meeting. It's because if you think that Sherry Fanaroff said it was leave, I have many conversations with Andy about how it was, he thought it was leave. It made no sense, as Sherry said, that it was leave was to bequest, and corporations don't make bequests. And I looked at it and did research at the archives that it seemed to be an original typewritten charter. And nobody else uses that phrase anywhere in the world. And as I said, there are a number of other references that say leasing, selling, or donating in the charter. And there's a cross-reference specifically to the provision that you deleted that still says leasing, selling, or donating. So that's why I think it was a typo.
So I get that, but, so is it, I want to make sure I'm clear on your position, that your position would be that by taking out the word lease, we've opened ourselves up to a loophole?
I think you did, because that's what happened with the collective restaurant that seems to have a long-term lease of open space. So whether you call it an easement for them to use the property or a lease, the result's basically the same. I guess an easement would be recorded in the land records and a lease is not normally.
Great, thank you, Joel.
Thank you.
Could be.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions? Thank you. Did anyone join us late? Thank you.
I can see.
That concludes resident speak out for this evening. To limit interruptions during board discussion, all members of the general public will now be returned to the audience. This means you'll no longer be able to show your camera or unmute your audio, but you're more than welcome to stay as an attendee to watch the remainder of the work session. You can also watch a live stream on the CA Livestream YouTube page. Thank you so much for your participation tonight. We will take a 10-minute recess and reconvene at 8:10. session topic is the draft FY 2025 budget. I believe we've got a presentation.
Susan has a presentation.
I do,
Thanks.
but I need my tech support. So,
I can find the text support.
Oh, it's not up.
She went to the bathroom.
Here comes text support. I think you're right. Yeah.
Are we all set with the presentation? Cool, thank you. Presentation's up and running?
yep,
Thank you.
thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Chris, can you see the presentation?
I'm seeing a timer right now.
Okay, can we make sure the
That
presentation
may be
is...
on my end if I pick the correct window.
Oh, yeah, that's the window.
No, it's just timer.
Can we make,
Chris.
can we make sure the presentation gets pushed out?
That's better. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. I think we should be all set.
Okay, so this, I won't run you back through this. This is the same material that we had last time. The only thing I wanted to just quickly go through is that we went through the exercise of aligning the outcomes to the strategic priorities. So, for example, the infrastructure have a plan for each critical area and fund the plan. We are just now wanted to present what in the budget, how the budget responds to that, particular charge. So we increased the capital funding, which we talked about last time. It's a 18% change over last year, and it's a 63% change over the 21 and 22 budgets. Not pre-COVID funding, but a significant step forward. It funds the current needs based on the plans and indices and the replacement cycles that we provided through the capital improvements program presentation and also in the pre-budget materials. And it also enables some investment in facility improvements. We talked about that. Supreme Sports Club renovations, the Lake Kittamakundi dredging of $1.5 million, and Stonehouse and Art Center improvements. It also, on the OpEx side, on the operating budget side, includes up to 2 facility assessments and dam inspections. So those are just the highlights of the things that are covered that meet the infrastructure charge. So accessibility, increase resident participation, for example, increase resident memberships and make things easier to promote engagement. So continues the extensive free programming and into the fall through Festive Fridays. Includes the modernization of the CRM, the Customer Relationship Management application, which is a big deal towards making things easier to promote engagement. And it expands communication and expands some program opportunities for Columbia card holders, CA points, and income qualified points memberships. So again, just some examples of where we're working to achieve the accessibility goal.
One quick question. Do you want us to hold questions to the end, or do you want them in between, during the slides?
It's up to you, whatever your preference is.
People have a preference?
I usually need to ask questions when I got them.
Okay. Okay. So we'll just
Anyone
ask
have a
them.
question?
I was just wondering. So I guess we'll just ask them during the slides.
Okay,
So
that's
if people
fine.
have them, just raise your hand.
Fine, that's fine.
Okay, thanks.
The next charge or strategic priority that you provided was affordability, to make living in CA more affordable by maximizing values for dollars spent while understanding the impact on annual charge. So no increase in the annual charge rate or cap, and that's despite the inflation that's at 40-year highs. It's affected just really everything, all the costs, materials, services, and labor needed to care for all of the amenities, including the open space. The increases in resident memberships, generally no higher than 3%, despite inflation and a 7% minimum wage increase in that fiscal year. No increases.
I'm sorry, Susan, I know I threw up your game. Haven't we basically been doing a 3% increase for the past several years? Like, has it been more than 3% in past years? Because I feel like when I look through, it feels like every year we kind of increase the memberships 3%.
We target 3%, and that even though it doesn't keep up with inflation, we kind of try to keep it for residents at that point and make up for it in other places. But there have been times where we've had to do more. The first time right after COVID, I can't remember exactly, was it 2017?
That was before.
No, that was before, yeah. The minimum wage first change.
Yes, and that was in 2020,
2020. Yeah, I don't even know what year it is anymore. The directive from the board at that point was that membership fees was to try to do, we were directed to increase the membership fees to try to cover as much of that as we could. So that year there was a larger membership increase. But we do our best to try to keep consistently around, for residents, around 3%.
Yeah, no higher. So,
I think we got a question from Bill first.
I just had a quick follow-up question for Dan. I don't want to rabbit hole, but just to follow up, you had mentioned the 3% increase and the inflation rate, which I believe largely is derived from the Consumer Price Index. As far as the price increases that community operations has seen, are they generally higher than the CPI or lower year in, year out, just roughly?
So you're talking for a membership?
For the costs that you see, cost increases for running the facilities, the chemicals for the pools, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, we've seen, particularly after COVID, we've seen things spike dramatically. The team has done a significant job in managing to the revenue. For the FY25 budget, in fact, the proposal is that my team's revenues will increase 10%, but expenses, fully loaded total operating expenses, will only go up 4%.
Okay.
So the team is trying to manage to that, but it does get challenging, particularly if you look at the payroll line item with significant minimum wage increases. And compression.
Andy?
Yeah, I just want to say, Bill, I've been working on this on another project, but the material cost index, which really kind of went up 21% in about a year and a half.
Wow.
So, I mean, it far exceeded inflation. So, yeah, it's okay to look at the consumer price index, but when you're talking about the material stuff, you know, it beat the consumer price index by, just want to make sure.
and that has been our experience, and we had, I know that last year, it was about a 12% average increase on on renewing contracts that were going up for goods and services. Everything went up a double digit. And the minimum wages, and this is it's not a bad thing, it's a right and, initiative, but the minimum wage has gone up 36% since December of 2021. So that's been a challenge, and that's driven some compression increases across the board a couple years ago. At the same time, though, there have been no increases in daily admission fees for everything except golf and indoor tennis. So I don't know if you noticed that in the budget, but those have been all held at zero increase. And then it also aligns with community input that prioritized funding existing assets rather than adding new ones.
Alan?
Is it?
You need your light on. Still need your light on.
Is it fair to say that daily admissions tend to come from non-residents?
No.
Okay. The reason for the question is that if it did, we'd be holding costs for non-residents steady while increasing 3% costs for residents, which didn't seem congruent with what we were asking, but thank you.
No, but, yeah.
Quick question, Susan. How much was the daily admissions, or how much of an increase was the daily admissions for the golf and indoor tennis? Do you know? I mean, if you don't, that's okay.
No, it's here, let's see. So golf,
Susan, you might want to pull that mic closer to you. Not getting-
so that's on page 89. I can't pull that in closer. And it varies. In some cases, there was no change. In others, there were anywhere from 2.7 to CA Fit and Play greens fees of 6.7. Most of the changes are under 3, so 4.2% for athletic club, indoor tennis, court time, long reach tennis, court time for some programs, 2.3. It's pages 88 through 92.
Okay. Thank you, Susan.
Any further questions on the slide? Actually, before you go on, I hate to go backwards, but I do have one question on the accessibility slide. So I noticed most of the events are sort of focused on the lakefront. Are there any events that we plan that are focused on taking place in the villages?
Aside from, you mean aside from the events that the villages are planning?
Yeah, that would fall into the budget.
So where the Columbia Core program is scheduled to start Earth Day, and that'll be out in the villages, but I don't have that specific list right now.
Also, there are a lot of free events at the Art Center, at Long Reach. Anything else?
Yeah, no, we don't do big events. We go to the villages and out in the community and do activities, but I don't particularly have any, Long Reach, we participate at the Art Center and Arts Fest and different programs there, but
Trunk or Treat also.
that happens at the sports park, which is in the Village Center.
Karen?
Yeah, Dennis, is there any ideas though to have what we do at Lakefront Live travel a little bit?
So we want to work a little closer with the villages, but I think that. So
Mine wasn't.
Can you repeat the question so people can hear it? Karen, can you repeat your question so they can hear it?
Yeah, what I was asking Dennis was there any thought in what happens for Lakefront Live traveling to the villages?
So I can't say that specifically right now, but we did hire someone whose job is to work with the villages, on a day-to-day, not day-to-day, but often. Jadelle Campbell, she was here last week. I don't know if you guys remember last time. I remember seeing her. And but that's something that I really need to sit down with the village managers and their boards to discuss in greater detail. And the first effort is going to center around the Columbia Core program, and that'll be on Earth Day, and then we'll move on from there.
Andy?
Yeah, I'd just like to point out, and you might want to think about that into your slide, but the Halloween event, which is so popular, and then the dog park. Which is another big popular one. So I didn't want to give the impression that everything was focused just, right on lakefront, but those are two really big, very popular events. And Bill?
Just chiming in with what Andy's saying, I think that there's a fine line here to have CA come in and Bigfoot a celebration inside a village, or taking over Slayton House and doing something when they already may have had something else planned. It's a delicate thing. But I will say that for village events in Wild Lake, CA has always played a big part in setup and support for our family picnic that we do every fall, our Election Day celebration. CA's there with tents and support and trash removal, and there is certainly investment in the partnership between the villages and CA throughout the year, for sure. That should not go unnoticed.
10.
I would be remiss if I forgot to mention Change in Columbia. which is not an outdoor event, but we very intentionally travel that around to the different villages and heavily promote that. And it's growing and continues to be well attended. So that is the example. You know, it is hard for us to go in and have the facilities to put on something similar to the lakefront, which is kind of designed for that. But the very intentional process of changing Columbia and continuing to do things like that.
Keith?
I was just wondering, what about the pools? What involvement does CA have in terms of the pools and all the activities that are happening there? Is that just like not just running the pools, but the
pool parties,
the swim teams, and all those other pieces? Is there any involvement there? Also,
we're heavily involved in everything that happens at the pools.
I mean, it's somewhat of a leading question, but I think to your point though, Karen, I think that's something really important that needs to be figured out too. Is how do we develop some plans, you know, moving forward to collaborate a little bit deeper. And I think there's probably a lot of things that are in the works, I sense, right, to make some of that happen, so.
Thanks.
Okay.
So environment, maintain a focus on environmental priorities, for example, fund the existing watershed plan. So the budget continues that stewardship effort. There are dedicated resources for open space maintenance, et cetera. I already mentioned the Lake Kit dredging. There's in the capital budget also $500,000 for watershed improvement projects that are referenced in our watershed management plan, the lake sediment management plan, and others. There's another over $2 million for other open space projects that include building energy retrofits and some going green projects. And then the category 3 allocation, the largest amount goes to open space for further projects. So in addition, what I didn't get on the slide was in the operating budget, there's increased funding for trash pickup, aquatic vegetation harvesting, and maintenance at the 3 lakes, a new full-time position, and expanded funding for tree planting, reforestation, and invasive plant management. So those are, again, just some of the highlights.
Yeah, I'm waiting for Eric because I did it wrong last time, so.
Bill and Karen.
Hi. Just for clarification, is the GIS work that is done in association with open space funded through that portion of the budget, or does that come from the technology side, or where is the cost center for?
That comes from that portion of the budget.
Okay, thanks.
Karen?
Yeah, go ahead, Jeremy, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's a little split, right? So the licensing for ArcGIS comes out of IT, but then the staff time to actually implement and go out and get those geospatial coordinates comes out of the operations team to actually go do that. Yeah,
that's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
Karen?
Yeah, this may not matter, but I think we have the watershed management plan on the agenda coming up for one of the future meetings. Is that true, or do I need to come to board operations and ask for that to be on the agenda?
I don't think it's not on the agendas right now.
Okay, yeah, because I
We don't have
think,
that many meetings left in this fiscal year. Doesn't mean it can't be, but right now it's not.
okay, thank you.
Staff training, be an employer of choice in Howard County. So this is providing, the budget includes converting a part-time position to full-time to support training curricula and facilitate training sessions. We had a manager training series kind of pre-COVID, but we've pulled that out, revamped it, we've expanded it, or are in the process of expanding it to be leadership development as well, and we started deploying it to team leaders. There's specific resources for DEIB initiatives, and we've also been putting a lot of staff energy and some consulting resources into improving the HRIS as an employee resource and manager tool. And that's important to give you're only as good of an employer as the tools you provide the employees. And we're providing for participation in webinars, conferences, and seminars to expand and develop skills. So including certificate programs for specific skill sets for the workforce.
Alan?
My question doesn't have to do with staff training, but it does have to do with being an employer of choice, and it overlaps with previous. Several years ago, before COVID, I remember us having a discussion around living wage. And I'm wondering, could you remind us what has been CA's, so you talked about rise in the minimum wage. Minimum wage isn't necessarily a living wage. So one way to look at it is if we've been paying a living wage, we wouldn't have to worry about a rise in the minimum wage, because if we've been paying a living wage, because we would have already been paying that kind of wage. What has been our policy, our stance, our way of approaching differences between living wage and minimum wage?
So the minimum wage primarily impacts the seasonal or part-time workforce, and the living wage we had applied to all full-time employees. So anybody who's full-time at least would meet the Howard County minimum living wage criteria.
Okay, thank you.
Karen?
Susan, I don't see this here, and I don't know if it's appropriate or not, but are we doing anything to survey just basic attitudes at work, like how people feel about working at CA? You know, would they recommend working at CA, that kind of stuff, their engagement? Are we doing anything around that? Because I really think, I mean, I know it says staff training, but I think when we were thinking of this category, it was really about what are we doing around job satisfaction?
So I don't recall that your discussion, but there's.
No, that's okay, that's okay, but.
So, but what we have done, we've just did a big survey and initiative on communication within the work, internal communication, and how well the workforce feels their, employees at all levels are receiving and able to give communication. So that's a big effort that we just saw preliminary results from. So there are multiple resources to that end. We have not done a comprehensive survey since before COVID, I don't believe, but we're doing different aspects.
I recently have done one with all of my team. We took a lot of the, I can never remember, the Q10 questions, and we pushed it out to a little over 700 of my team members that are in my area of oversight. We had about 350 responses. And we particularly found that the most common, we asked for very little information, so it was anonymous, but where they worked, and we kind of grouped the smaller or teams together so that you couldn't identify somebody.
Right.
And part-time or full-time. And what we got back was more work on personal and professional development.
Okay.
Is really kind of, and my team, is working with the training and learning and development team and figuring out how we can grow that, because we kind of heard that from both sides.
Okay. Yeah, that's what we just wanted to know. Are we investing in that at all? So thank you.
Alan?
Just a question for you, Dan, relating back to DEIB efforts. You said we asked minimal data. So I don't know if this is a statement or a question. In our work, we always encourage organizations to ask demographic questions so you can disaggregate the data. Because saying, if we said, pick a number, 85% of our employees would recommend this to somebody else, well, is that differential among different groups? So if you don't, I would encourage you to make sure you're tracking that data so you can dig a little deeper.
Thank you.
And then the last two, I just crammed on one page here. Grants, continue the grant funding. You all, I'm sure, remember well, you approved including $80,000 for the Veterans Monument and then $30,000 for grants to other nonprofits. And the last one, ensure that we fund the existing strategic plan. Many of these strategic initiatives were elements of the current and expiring strategic plan. So, again, the strategic plan's in the budget. It was a document that we relied on heavily to move forward in alignment with your strategic initiatives, and I think that we've done a good job with your priorities to make sure that we've addressed them to the extent that the funds allow. And that's it, I didn't have any other prepared.
Was that 30,000 or 20,000? I've seen
There was already
20,000.
10 in the operating
Okay.
budget, and you approved an additional 20.
Bill?
Okay, a little bit of a wild card. Thank you for your presentation tonight. Seeing as we're getting close to voting on the budget, I went through and was looking at some of our emails and communications. Something that I had seen all during our budget process, but we haven't addressed, was the issue of sister cities. We've gotten a number of emails from people that were involved in that program, and from best I can tell in our budget analysis here, our documents, doesn't seem to be any real change to the program. It seemed to be moving along, and the emails that we're getting, I just want to make sure that folks understand that program is going to continue and be funded, and there isn't any concern. I just want to make sure we put that to rest.
I'll speak to that. So, two things. One, the sister cities, they advocate every year.
Yeah.
Because it's a small program, so they always worry, and they're committed, we're committed. But this year, we did have our program manager unexpectedly move to Seattle. So what we did is we took time to do this intentionally for the rehire. We reached out to multiple community partners to see how we have this opportunity, how we could best help fill the space. Is what we're doing the right thing? We met with the Howard County Office of Equity, met with the chair of the committee, met with the equity team from the HOCO library. So we brought had all these different meetings to now, and then we rewrote the job description to how we could best fill the gaps. So that job is now being posted. And our goal is to have that position hired and filled by the start of the fiscal year.
I just want to make sure they were heard, and thank you for that great story. That's fantastic. Good work. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions on the slides? So I do have a couple questions. So budget keeps the annual charge at 68 cents. Do you have an idea for a typical resident owner, what's the average annual charge bill for FY24, and what would the annual charge bill for FY25 for your typical average homeowner?
Yeah, so you asked that in an email, and we did not have the time to get the answer to you for that tonight. So we'll have that before the next discussion, and it should be hopefully by the middle of next week. Just had other priorities, folks out with illness.
And you have a rough shot in the dark?
About
plus or-
$1,000 roughly.
Okay.
I would think that would depend upon single-family homes or townhouses or condos.
Yeah, and where it's located and how big it is. It depends on a lot of things, but I'm just trying to get an idea of like your average Colombian, what does 68 cents mean? Because it varies quite a bit. Are there any, Andy?
Actually, one that Bill had mentioned, which was the 250th anniversary of the U.S. is coming up. And 2025 would probably be a great year to start planning. So I just want to kind of add that, but I'll put it on to Bill because Bill was the one who brought it up.
So that's already been discussed, and in fact, I'm meeting with Nick Moonihan, who's now the Director of Recreation and Parks for Howard County, to talk about some of the programming that we're going to do and that we can do together. So it's on our list.
Great.
Keith, in terms of your question, Eric, is the average what you're really looking for, or is there some other number that you're looking for? Because it felt a little bit leading, and I want to make sure that when we get the research back, that it's
average, median. Those would both be reasonable answers. I mean, is there a statistic that you would look for?
Oh, not. I mean, I just wanted to make sure we were clear because especially when you mention home values and so on and so forth. Does it need to be broken down by village? Does it? Are there any other slices that you're looking to take a look at?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if we had a detailed analysis, that'd be great. I'm not sure such a detailed analysis we have time for in 2 weeks, but I'm basically trying to get an idea, trying to The idea is like, we talk about 68 cents, but that's sort of an abstract number. I'm trying to get a better idea of what does that mean for typical homeowners, typical people that are paying the lien? What does that mean come July when you get your bill?
Okay, so the average is probably fine then?
Yeah, average probably fine,
Okay.
median's probably fine. Both is probably, both might be interesting. Reg?
Yeah, I would kind of have a problem with that a little bit, because what is an average resident of Columbia? I mean, you've got single parents, you've got double income, no kids, you've got, I mean, all sorts of spectrum. So that's really, when you're asking Susan to provide that type of information, there's a whole gamut of, factors. I mean, you got to hone it down a little bit more than that, because otherwise you're asking her to throw out the.
I was just thinking, take all the annual charge bills, add them up, and compute a mean and compute a median.
I'd like to see the
Sky.
standard deviation.
Standard deviation would be useful also. I mean, if we got a list of numbers.
More than the mean and the average.
Yeah, if we've got a list of numbers, they're easy enough to compute in Excel. Any other Excel statistics that people would want to?
The more you add, the more likely it will be that it won't be by the middle of next week. Throwing that out there.
So that's what I'm saying, it just doesn't, I mean, it doesn't add up, just.
I guess my question is, what metrics would you like to see?
I'm not the one asking the question. My concern is you're putting it out there saying, you're asking them to provide what does that mean, the assessment mean to a regular Columbian? Who is a regular Columbian? Who is that? Who's that made of? What village? What type of home? What economic stance does that person have? I think it's just making it a very difficult target to hit.
Keith?
Yeah, I was thinking that it might be an interesting, strategic discussion to say, what is our, what does this look like overall, and how are we hitting targets, especially when we take a look at one of the other charges in terms of accessibility. I think we need to layer in there, all of those components when we have a discussion there. So I think it is a lot broader. That's the reason why I wanted to make sure that, when the information came back, is it providing what you're looking for? And if it's the average and that's fine, but I just wanted to make sure we didn't step into it, and next time we're having a discussion, it turns into a bigger conversation than it was intended.
Yeah, don't disagree with me, don't misunderstand.
Yeah, somehow I'm getting the impression that your basic question is not necessarily about the average, but maybe the average increase per year and what that means. And I don't know where I'm getting that impression, but.
Well, it's because I asked for 24 and 25. So that's where you might have gotten that impression, because I asked for 24 and 25 data. Karen?
I mean, is there an issue with everybody that Eric asked the question at all? I mean, we all ask for data all the time. I'm just kind of wondering about why we're having this conversation.
Bill, then Keith?
Yeah, just really quick, Eric, is this for just like a guidepost kind of query, or is this a value judgment that you're asking for?
Okay, I apologize. Just to that, all I was asking truly is to understand, the nature of it, so that when we got to the next conversation, that it didn't turn into a big blow up. And I think I got that answer. Right, but I think I got that answer, and you're right, Karen. Can I retract the whole conversation?
In my defense, what I'm trying to do is get a better understanding of how competitive we are relative to other HOAs. So, I mean, you look at a similar HOA, say like Reston, and their annual charge next year is $817 per year, and that includes pool passes. So the question I have is, how does that affect us? I mean, are we competitive with other HOAs in the area? I'll go to Andy.
Yes, but the problem is that is not the right question to ask, because one of the big things that guides how much we get is the assessment, which we have no control over. I mean, if Reston's assessment stayed the same, okay, and ours shot up 20%, we are going to get more money, you're going to pay more money, but not because we raised, the thing or something too. So if we're going to go that route, we have to take into account the actual assessment. And I mean, why are you paying more from 24 to 25? The answer is because your assessment went up. not because we raised the rate or anything. And so I want to make sure we don't give the wrong impression, because, you can get that information and people say, look, CA, raised my bill by such, and no, the state raised your assessment. We kept the rates the same. I just don't want to get into that situation.
We could theoretically lower the rate so that the bills stay the same. Reg, then Dennis.
Okay, so I really wasn't trying to say that Eric doesn't have the right to ask this question, because it's a good question. It's just that I thought it was asked the wrong way, because we're leading Susan to failure already, because she's got to provide a whole gamut of information without any central.
I first asked just for a couple numbers.
It's just not just numbers. You're asking for information. What is the average Columbia pay? And there's no such thing as an average Columbia, because each one of us has a different lifestyle, different aspect of our culture and economic stature. So you can ask the question. I have no problem with asking the question. I think the question is legitimate. I just felt that it was just too large of a target to shoot for.
So average doesn't necessarily mean typical, but I'll get Dennis in now.
So I love the saying, what one HOA is not like the others?
Yeah.
Right, it's CA. CA is not like Reston. How many teen centers are in Reston? How many art centers are in Reston?
No idea.
How many Sister Cities programs? How many indoor pools? How many tennis clubs? How many pathways? How many ponds? How many lakes? We are not exactly the same as Reston. So to compare them without taking into consideration all the nuances that separate us from them, I don't think is fair.
Sky?
And if you want to compare us with Reston, you need the same data from Reston. If you're asking for the mean or the standard deviation, and without that information, our data doesn't.
The mean, median, and mode are all
publish
$817. It's a flat fee.
Website.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Eric, just as polite as I can say, I understand that the meeting previous to this and this one, you've raised the fact that there are other homeowners associations that charge less than the Columbia Association. And in the context of this budget discussion that we're having, where we've predicted that at the end of FY25, we will more than likely run out of money, we have to understand that we're managing to what the costs are in this community here. We will most likely have to take a short-term loan to finish 2025, FY25. So let's understand the cost structure that we have here and try and manage to what it costs to actually be the Columbia Association, and not try and compare ourselves to the people across Guilford Road or another homeowners association in Reston, and provide the value that we have for this community.
Susan, this
Can
budget doesn't call for short-term loans, does it?
So we think in early 2026, Q1 of 2026. So not April 30, but May, June, July of 2026.
Yeah.
Short term.
Very
short term.
Keith. So I don't know. I'll come out on the side of Eric here in this sense. I'm very interested in comparing us to Reston and other places. I don't want it to be a number. I want it to be a full comparison when we look at it, so that we can put it to rest and there aren't talking points, but rather we can say, here's the foundation and the context for what Reston is doing. Here's what we're doing. How does that compare? And I think there'll be some really meaningful things that'll come out of that. But I want to make sure, and that's part of the reason why I started this, and I probably should have just kept my mouth shut until the strategic conversation, but
touchdown.
Yeah, it needs to be a broader conversation. And I didn't want to ask for a piece of information and then all of a sudden it turns into a comparison that we really weren't prepared for. Because if we put talking points up there, that's where we run into problems. Frankly, that's where the society is running into problems, right? It's just having a piece of information without context.
Right.
Alan?
Yeah, I just want to second everything you just said, Keith, and add that there, in addition to some of the ways, Dennis, that you said that we are different than Reston Association, there are other ways that they are different that we might want to look at to emulate. Mm-hmm. So there's things on both sides of that equation.
Yeah. And I don't mean that we should go to a flat rate of $817 tomorrow. I mean, that's probably not feasible, but I'll note that Reston's taken some interesting steps to promote affordability and accessibility by actually, they used to charge for their pools and now they're included with the HOA fee. So there are things we can learn. I'm just sort of throwing that out there.
Yep.
Any other questions on the budget? Any other comments? And with that, we'll go to the next item on the agenda. And that would be the board work sessions and meetings new agenda format. And I don't have any backup material for this.
Before we leave the budget,
Oh, okay.
it probably ought to be firmly implanted in my mind, but so next step is, you gave this presentation with an eye toward helping us do what next?
Be prepared to make a decision in 2 weeks.
So in 2 weeks is the last meeting regarding the budget. So we'll take a vote on the budget, and that'll occur in 2 weeks.
Are we assuming that any amendments, how are we wanting to handle that sort of process? Assuming that any amendments should have already been brought up and.
Amen, brother.
So if we get to this vote next week. If you have amendments, please email them to Dennis, myself, CC the board, and we'll try to compile a list of them and then we can go through them. Does that sound like reasonable? Does that sound like reasonable policy?
What our process
Reasonable plan?
We should have already had.
We should have already had them, but.
It's hard to discuss them at the last meeting.
Or to analyze them, right?
Right. I'm just going to put on record that if we've gotten to this point, and not that you're saying you're going to, but if we've gotten to this point as a board and no one has brought forward any sort of, I think that's an ethics problem, honestly, because someone's hiding something at that point, right? So, speak your mind or let's move along, because if we get all the way through months and months of this process, and then literally on the last day of a vote for a budget, we're going to bring up something that we want to slide into the budget and then take us until 1 o'clock in the morning to discuss it, that's a major problem.
I don't see that as an ethics issue. I mean, it could be a
I do, but that's an opinion, right? But I'm just saying that if we've gotten through this and we've not brought something up to the rest of the board, and I'm very firm on this, from my opinion, okay, that if someone is holding something back, that's a huge problem from my standpoint, because you haven't been transparent with the rest of the board, and we've been open and trying to get to that point. That would be frustrating.
I would add that this budget is not the simplest budget in the world to go through. So, and when I go through it, I'm always learning new things all the time. So it's not that people are holding things back when they make an amendment. They might have learned something new, or someone made them aware of something. So just because someone tries to add an amendment the day we vote doesn't necessarily mean it's an ethics issue. It just means they might have learned something new.
Okay.
Or someone addressed a concern. Like we get concerns that residents speak out all the time. So I don't see that as an ethics issue.
It's good that we disagree. You don't have to pass judgment on my.
I'm not passing judgment.
I'm actually not hearing either of you disagree. I think you're speaking about two different things, and I would absolutely agree with you, Keith, that if anybody has already got something in mind that they haven't brought up, I'm not sure I would use the word ethics, but I agree with you. That's a breach of our duty to each other to work together. I also agree that not all of us are as quick studies as others, and there are often things that it'll come to me towards the end, and that's not holding back. That's just.
So, when we talk about these amendments, that we're only talking about like material things, because most things we really shouldn't be bringing up an amendment. Like material things are the ones that we're discussing, right? Like I don't know. We're not going to, for instance, no one's going to come up hopefully and say, hey, we are going to add $100,000 to the community grants or something like that, because those are the types of things that are really bothersome to me.
So typically amendments, if they'd come up from, say, the villages, where a village might meet and say, oh, they've got a capital request for project XYZ that happened to not be in the capital budget, something like that.
But where's our responsibility?
In October. They should have come up in October.
I'm just, where's our responsibility in that? Because I go back and talk to my village on a regular basis to ask them what's going on and where we are. So again, I'm sorry to get fired up about it, but I'm hoping that literally we walk in here and frankly, we can even recommend putting this into the consent agenda, because after all of this conversation, we shouldn't really be having a major discussion is my hope. I'm done.
Okay. Any more comments on the agenda, or on the budget?
Can we put it in the consent agenda?
No,
Why not?
because not everybody may consent.
Well, then you vote on it.
Then we vote on it.
decide to vote,
Then we vote on it. So it'll be up for a vote.
I think it's good to take an affirmative vote.
Besides, people do like to see people, our residents, I believe, like to see people vote on the budget and their annual charge, which is the official vote on the annual charge happens when we actually pass the budget. So people like to see us on record for that.
No, we already approved it.
Yeah, we did.
We already approved it in October.
Yeah, that's for the budget.
No.
It's in the budget.
No.
So,
No, we approved.
yeah, I realize that. I realize that.
Yes.
But the budget contains all this. So people like to see the budget approved. That's
But that's different from the annual charge. The annual charge is already set.
got it. Anyway, can we move on to the next item on the agenda? Okay, board work sessions and meetings.
Breath of fresh air, just really quick. I should have, when we approved the agenda, asked this to be removed from the agenda. I was not present at the last meeting. I had a terrible stomach bug, and it had pretty long road trying to get back on my feet. So it's not ready. I intend to have this submitted to staff for review by Monday, and we will take it up at the next agenda. So I'd like to politely move on.
So while this is on the agenda, I know people, I'm not sure if people have any just general comments that they might want to say for like 5 minutes.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to make a motion to table.
Okay, we got a motion to table.
Second.
Is there a second? Are there any objections to tabling?
I have one.
You're objecting to your.
No, I have one point of discussion on the topic. I just wanted to say, and I think this is fair, to say that this being on the agenda and motioning to table should not count as part of the 3-meeting rule. And I think that's a fair thing to stay as part of this tabling event. So I apologize for the extra 60 seconds, but I thought it was an important point.
Okay, are there any objections to tabling? Motion is tabled, or the, not the motion, it's the topic is tabled. Next we have foresee the easement policy. I believe is there a presentation for this?
Jared has a presentation that
Okay.
spends some time on the existing policy and some facts.
You just,
That one.
if you want to do that.
Okay, wonderful.
Chris, can you see the presentation?
Yes, sir.
I've got lots of papers here.
Okay. All right, thank you. And I've been designated to speak about the easement review process as it currently exists. Some of this is legal, some of this is not. It's practical. I myself focus largely on the legal aspect.
John, got a question?
Legal is not practical.
I do have a question on legal. Is there, what, if any, legal information should be discussed in closed session?
Yeah, I'm going to try to give general, non-controversial legal, rather than legal opinions. I will address simple concepts like that I don't think are controversial, like what is an easement under the law? What is a license? What is a lease? What do the cases say about specific provisions? If you have questions and get into an area that I think would not be appropriate for public session in that you're asking for legal advice, I will so state and we can hold it. But I'm hoping that all this will be open and not in that realm. I mean, this is more informational than anything else. That's the way I would proceed. Okay. All right, so easement review process. Oops. So much for that. There we go.
Sorry.
Well, that's what we have.
Okay. So this is the process that is based on the policy the board passed. That's the policy. This is in your packet, right? This goes back to it's not called easements, although it's been labeled the easement policy, but this is the policy from October of 2008 called Procedure on Transactions of CA Real Property. And that's been designated as the easement policy, but if you look at the policy, I don't think the word easement appears in there, right?
It's not.
As does, if you look at the charter, easement doesn't appear in there either. But it's been interpreted, I think, that this is what applies to easement. So I think it would be appropriate to define what an easement is, so we know what we're talking about, right? And the definition comes right from the case law. An easement is an interest in land owned by another person consisting in the right to use or control the land or the area above or below it for a specific limited purpose, right? That's an easement. In other words, you own the land and you give permission for someone else to do something to it. And they have rights to do it, but you still own the land. Now, related to that is a license. That's a little different. It's also could be considered a land transaction if you're doing that. And a license is defined as a permission, usually revocable, to commit some act that would otherwise be unlawful, especially an agreement not amounting to a lease or for profit that is lawful for the licensee to enter the licensor's land to do some act that would otherwise be illegal. That's a license, such as if you gave someone a license to go on your land and shoot deer, that's a license.
So it's not that the act would be illegal, it's that doing it on the other person's land would be illegal.
Without the license would be illegal. And finally, a lease, that's a little different, is a written agreement usually in which the owner of property allows the use of property for a specific period of time, which is called the term of the lease, for specific periodic payments, which is usually the rent, and other terms. So those things differ, but I'm sorry, go ahead, Alan.
Well, going back to easement, you said for a limited purpose. I'm thinking, for example, we have a perpetual easement with the Inner Arbor Corporation. How is that, help me understand how limited shows up there.
Is that a closed meeting topic if we're talking about a specific?
I don't see how
It's a
that's
public
closed.
Everybody's easement is
contract?
out there.
Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think in that instance, even though it's perpetual, doesn't mean you can use it for every purpose. It's what's defined in the easement itself. So there are specific things that you could do, use a specific, for example, and I'm not talking about that, but improvements that you have. For example, in the agreement, the easement agreements between IAT and It's My Amphitheater, you know, there's who has the right to make improvements. They can do certain things. They don't have to get permission. That could be written in a lease. In an easement. And that's part of the thing I want to address here that makes this a very complicated area in that there's extensive legal work in these easements that typically involve CA, open space, and land are in many cases extremely complicated, very labor intensive. From a legal point of view, we will use typically outside counsel because There are many, many nuances that you have to be aware of. And it literally can take months and months to get these things done. And cost, and I can go through this later, thousands and thousands of dollars to do this. And just to give you an idea of the process and how many leases, or I'm sorry, how many easements we're talking about, we maintain a record, CA maintains a record of easements and agreements of record, and right now there are 652 entries on it.
Those are just easements?
But not just easements, there are also agreements. A large part of those are easements, but there are also, I mean, there's a few licenses on those. We also have a specific document that talks about licenses. There are a lot fewer, but in excess of 200 licenses that we have. So this is an area that keeps the staff extremely, extremely busy.
The 652, is that current, or is that?
That's through the years. I mean, some of those are current. For example, there's a BGE has an easement to come on our property perpetually, right? So that's been here for ever, and that's listed there. But as a new one comes on, it's added to the bottom of the list. So this goes back. I mean, I can look how far it goes back, but I mean, literally, this could go back to the 60s.
Do we keep track of which ones are no longer in effect?
Right, that's what I was just going to ask.
The document here strikes things that are not in effect. I mean, Jeremy could speak to that, but I think we do. You know, there are some easements that may be written to expire in a certain period of time. When they do, it's scratched. But
They're still included in the 652?
No. If they're not there, they're no longer valid.
These are just active agreements.
So these are the current?
These are the current.
These are active agreements.
So the other point I want to make, so you as the board or your predecessors have set out this procedure that governs, at least has been interpreted, easements. But what happened is then the staff has to implement that policy, and it's like Congress passes a law and then it goes to the administrative agencies to implement. And the implementation and the policy that the staff takes from the board's direction is on the CA website and is included in your packet. There were two documents included in the packet. I think it's pages 7 and 8 of the packet. And that's taking your policy, and this is how the staff implements it.
So I got a question on A2 and B2. So it says CA shall obtain professional appraisal of the value of the property that is subject to the transaction if deemed necessary. Who does the deeming?
Well,
and what's the criteria?
That's a good question. We'll get into that. Ultimately, I think it's the board. You make the decision. The staff makes the recommendation, but the board votes on these things.
So the board should be taking a vote on whether or not to order an appraisal?
No, I think that's part of the easement. I think that's part of the vote. If you're going to vote on an easement, if you don't believe that the proper information has been furnished, then you can reject the easement and go back and say, do it again. But I think that's part and parcel of your vote. At some point, the staff has to make a decision as to whether it's, and I'll talk about value. I've tried to do this in order, and this may take a long time. And I understand, some of these questions will come up. But when we're talking about valuation, there are problems inherent in that. The standard itself, I'll just go through the standard for what's the social welfare. What does that mean? That's written in the policy. That comes from
our charter.
The charter, right? What is that? Social welfare of the people of Columbia. What does that mean? There's actually case law on what social welfare means in the context of homeowners associations and IRS tax exempt status. And the case law says and this goes to interpretation, is it's a very broad interpretation. What it means is for the general public. So you interpret it broadly, and even though, for example, if you were going to say, well, that means just something that benefits the residents. The case law says no, it's not just the residents, because if you limit it to the residents, that's not the general public. And you need a broader interpretation or you lose your tax exempt status. So when you talk about social welfare, you're talking about how does it affect people who live, work, play in Columbia?
Hey, John, can I ask you a question about social welfare? So isn't the social welfare, I mean, if you're going to do something for social welfare, so say, take, for example, the pools, right? We need to make those, we can't restrict the pools. You're not doing social welfare. You lose your tax exempt status if you restrict the pools just to residents, right? Is that how you're thinking of it? Because whenever you do something, when we do Lakefront Live, no matter what we're doing, it has to be accessible to everyone. You can't just restrict it and say, no, only residents can enjoy this.
Well, I'm talking specifically as to interpretation for property transactions and not.
Right, but I'm trying to understand the social welfare. Like you said, it's very broad, so I'm trying to just understand,
Yeah, I'll tell you what the context of the cases are.
Yeah.
Is involving homeowners associations. And the court says, well, you applied your rules just to the people who live in your little community. You're insulated. And in order to get this public benefit of social welfare, like, you can't just open your parks to the people who live there.
Right.
Everybody can come in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically what it means.
Yeah, okay, I should have used the pathways as my example.
So, I mean, in our policy, we limit it to, we say, promotion of social welfare for the people of Columbia. So, of the people of Columbia, it sort of limits it, and not all of Howard County. I mean, because it just says people of Columbia.
I understand that. Again, I think that's a very broad term. So if people of Columbia includes Dennis Matty, if he doesn't live in Columbia and comes and works here, or if someone visits Merriweather to enjoy concert, that's a person who's in Columbia. I'm just trying to say it's a broader transaction. For the most part, you're going to get people who live and work here included within the idea of, does it meet the social welfare?
Yeah, just the converse of that is we can't exercise social welfare to benefit the people of Bowie and expect to get it to count for us, right? So that's why I think Columbia is part of that statement.
Alan?
Going back to the types of land things, easements, licenses, leases, where do land swaps fit into that scheme?
Well, land swaps are used sometimes to, in lieu of perpetual easements. In other words, I think there's been transactions in the past where it was deemed advantageous, rather than put a perpetual easement on the land, CA could trade a piece of property, then we don't have to encumber that land forever. We can take this piece, they could take theirs, and so that's where.
Still be part of this policy?
It still would be part of the policy, yeah, and I think it's included, but it's a way to avoid an easement and make it more, make it easier for the corporation.
So here's where I'm a little confused when we say people of Columbia. I think that's actually too vague, because, I mean, if we're talking about Columbia, including all the out parcels that have Columbia addresses, okay, they're people of Columbia, but what about people that live in the Columbia Association that, say, live in Clarksville or Ellicott City? So again, I'm trying to figure out, when we say the people of Columbia, is there a definition of who are those people?
Well, there's not, because there haven't been cases like that. But I can tell you just from the cases that are out there, and they don't pertain to Columbia specifically, they pertain to these tax cases that are from, actually there's one in Maryland from the federal court that went to the Fourth Circuit. There's another one from one of the other circuit courts. But they take a broader view. So I take that to mean we have to take a broad view. You know, if we went to court, what does people of Columbia mean? What I'm telling you is, I know, or I feel pretty strongly that if you're going to say that this policy only applies to residents, that's not good enough. It's because residents are not the only people of Columbia. That's all I'm saying.
Any other questions? Bill.
Just a quick follow-up to my last statement. I think the people of Bowie are fine people. I was just using them as an example.
I certainly wasn't referring to the people of Bowie, but keep in mind, CA covers multiple zip codes, multiple towns. I mean,
I wouldn't confuse mailing address with the people of Columbia.
In addition to Columbia, we've got Clarksville addresses, we've got Ellicott City addresses. There are out parcels in Clarksville, out parcels in Ellicott City. So
Don't forget the Columbians that also have Jessup addresses. I don't want to shortchange Jessup.
I don't want to shortchange them either.
Okay.
But again, I just want to try to better, because this actually came up when we talked about the strategic plan. I'm just still trying to better understand when we say people of Columbia, who do we actually mean specifically?
Relatedly, the census does not consider Dorsey Search part of Columbia. It's not part of the census designated place. That's another lens that you could look at how Columbia is viewed.
That's what I'm referring to with Ellicott City.
There are many different things
They've got Ellicott City addresses.
So, but we can all call it the people of Columbia, I think.
Karen.
So when we're talking about these policies, if you call it, would it apply, John? I mean, if you can't answer this, that's fine. But, and I'm sorry to do this to everyone, the Reston strategic plan specifically calls out residents. Their whole focus is on residents. We're doing this for the residents, for the benefit of the residents. So they can do that. They're an HOA. They can do that. But when you're talking about policies like this, is there a distinction between I can call out residents here, but I can't do it here? Is that?
Well, it depends on the context. I'm talking about the term social welfare and how that's been interpreted. I don't know what the rest of
No, but I'm just asking, like, if you call it out in one, like, can you call it out in a strategic plan, but not in your policies? I'm trying to understand how we would apply it. So if you're writing, and if we would write a new policy, how would we need to make a distinction?
I would say if you're going to be consistent with case law and the charter, that when you use the term people of Columbia, it's viewed broadly. That's all I'm saying. Now, that's not to say that there might not be places where you could name residents, get certain benefits. Obviously, residents do get certain benefits. They pay a certain, and they get, I pay less to do, certain activities. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just using it in the context here.
We just have to share.
Yes. Okay. So let me also talk, because I think this is important when we talk, we're talking easements, but when we talk licenses, it's important to make a distinction because this does apply typically to residents. For example, smaller land transactions where, and this has happened to me, where you need to get your trees cut. And when you do this, what you'll make arrangements, and the tree company will say, we'll be out sometime in the next 4 weeks. We'll give you about 3 days notice. And when they call you on Thursday, they'll say they'll be there Monday, but they need to get onto CA's open space to cut your trees, because that's the only way they can get in. And this is actually related to my property, because you have to come in that way. Now, we could require an easement for that, but we don't, because if we went through the easement process, it would take months and months. We do a temporary access license, and we give them permission, and this way it facilitates what works for the residents, because there's no need to go through a one-size-fits-all policy for an easement and get an evaluation and everything else, when all they want to do is have this company come on and go over our open space and get close to my trees and cut them down. Now, we do a license that, we're not going to have them damage our property. They have to agree to do that. But rather than do an easement, That's typically done to service resident, and it works. So that's an example of, it's a land transaction, and it could be an easement. If you had a policy that everything's subject to an easement, that wouldn't work.
Karen?
Yeah, okay, let me ask you a question about that. So getting that license, what is the process for getting that license? For you as the homeowner, do you have to get that license? How does that work? Jeremy gives you the license? Did you take him to dinner?
Whoever the contractor is would have to get the license. Whoever is actually.
The tree service company gets the license?
Whoever is actually traversing our property would be the one required to get the license, to have the bonding to be required for any damage that they would prepare it. So it's not the.
That's what I wanted to know. Okay, thank you.
Colin?
Going back to the professional appraisal, and A3 talks about ancillary expenses. I think this is more for you, Dennis, perhaps. I don't need an exact number, but what percentage of easements of those 652 have we gotten a professional appraisal of the value of the property and charged the person who wants the easement ancillary expenses? Give or take, I mean, what are we talking?
So the vast majority were done before my time in my current job. Probably not before my time, but before my time in my current job. But, so when we get we use adjacent land values, and the Whole Foods one is a good example. So we valued that little area based on the square foot valuation for Whole Foods. And that, in my opinion, is a professional appraisal. The state has that appraisal. So in many cases, that's, how we use either that adjacent property appraisal from the state, or we would require a professional appraisal to be paid for by the person who's asking for the easement.
Because I don't remember numbers like that showing up in our discussions, so maybe it's my oversight.
Jeremy?
Numbers like
what the appraisal was, what's the value, because my sense is, and my wish is that we think about the value of the easement to the person asking for the easement, particularly if it's a for-profit company, and that we get some remuneration, and that's at least in part based on the value of what they're getting and what the value of the property and all. Those seem like relevant numbers, as well as A3, which talks about other ancillary expenses.
So I agree with everything that you said, and when I look at it that way. If there's a, for instance, on the fiber optic cable that ran through the transit strip in front of Whole Foods, if it's not used for that exact purpose, it goes away. Because I was thinking that, well, maybe later they'd want to put, whatever's the next greatest thing. It's the hologram machine that goes through the property that, whatever Star Trek thing happens later, but it's not allowed, right? That goes away when they stop using it for that purpose. So, there are, we think about that when we process them. And because my first thought is, what's in it for CA?
Jeremy?
Well, I was just going to note that a majority of the valuations are the adjacent property construct, which is the alternative compliance pathway, because it is so difficult to actually assess the value of our property. So that's the most common way it goes.
And do we get, give or take, again, I don't need an exact number, what percent of easements do we get some remuneration for?
Virtually all of them.
We do.
The ones that we've processed recently. Now, we can't go back 30 years.
I understand. Yeah.
Bill?
And just for everybody's, the state doesn't actually assess a value on any of the open space property.
Yeah, I mean, that's a point we're going to bring up. So one of the problems with getting an appraisal is the state values open space at 0. Right? So how do you get appraisal? And the reason it's 0, like if we sold our property to a developer to put in 100 townhomes, it's worth a lot of money, but we can't do it. So it has no value. So how do you put a value on that? And what's done, or what's been done, and what usually works, is you look at the adjacent property, like the Whole Foods. That property is valued at $30,000. We get that figure, okay. And many times, right, the developer or the applicant will agree to that because it makes sense. Because frankly, it's very difficult to get an appraisal of what this property is worth because it has no value. The other thing I would mention, just as that you all should be aware of as a board, if we were to start putting values on our open space, the state would look to tax anything that moves.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Right?
yeah, absolutely.
So it will cost us a ton of money if we start getting evaluations of all this open space. You think the state's not gonna come after that? Absolutely.
Does our,
So it's,
I got a question. Does our tennis complex, does that have a valuation, a state assessed valuation?
I'm not sure.
yeah.
The Long Reach tennis courts,
Long Beach Tennis, there are a handful of properties for which we do pay real property tax.
we pay taxes on that, property taxes on that?
Right, there are some.
Not necessarily that one, but there's some that we, for instance, Supreme Sports Club, that, is
So
that,
there are others that, the golf courses, we pay real property taxes on. There are others.
okay.
So the other question I have is, so when we're looking at adjacent values, are we looking at state assessments or independent appraisals of the adjacent values?
I think you're,
I think it varies.
yeah, it could be either. I mean, I think, Dennis gave the example of the fiber optic. I think that's a good one. That was the value that they had, and we made out pretty well on that deal. Because that was a good, for basically a piece of land that was.
Because I guess the concern I have is someone goes to sell their house, they're not going to appraise their house based on the state assessment. They're going to get a real estate appraiser to appraise their house for a selling price.
You can, but how do you get an appraiser to put a value on a piece of property that the state says isn't worth anything?
Karen?
Well, I mean, I have a question about that, because if we're not using the land, or if it's just open space, people can walk on it, residents can walk on it, it's zero. But if someone wants to do something with that land where they can make a profit on that land now has value. So why couldn't an appraiser say, well, if you're doing nothing with the land, of course it's zero, but now this person sees value in it and they stand to make, and this is why I'm saying I think that we maybe want to reverse our processes and say, here's what I plan to do with your land, and then the appraiser can say, oh, well, your land is actually worth this. If they're going to do that, that makes this land worth this much. I mean, you could do that with your land and you would stand to make this.
That's one approach. I mean, I certainly think that's one approach you could take.
Are we, I guess the question is, are we appraising the land or are we appraising the improvement to the land for someone else's benefit?
The value of what we're giving somebody.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely difficult. The point I just want to make is it's extremely difficult to get an objective of open. Now, what's the value of beautiful open space? Trees and birds and, yeah, I mean, it has some value to people, but in terms of dollars and cents, if the state's not collecting anything on it, for property tax purposes, it doesn't have a value.
But Bill and Andy. Bill.
Okay, just a quick update. Just so everybody knows, I think like the open space that the tennis club in Long Reach sits on, many people think it's valuable. It certainly has an intrinsic value. The state books say that it's worth $0. I just looked. So there you go.
Cool. Thanks. Andy.
Yeah, and I think John brought up a really important point that the board has got to consider. Right now, our land is valued at zero. Okay, and he's right. If we assess it and come up with a value and start doing it, the state is going to start charging us. And to, talk about the welfare of Columbia, I do not want our open space taxed. And so I want to make sure what John has laid out is let's use the next door property, which is very kind of good, and you work with the thing, but then you don't put an official price on a piece of land, because then the state is going to come back. But I think that's a good point. Thank you.
Reg, then Karen.
So I want to throw a little monkey wrench in the whole thing. I have 2.5 acres here in Columbia, in Long Reach. I have, of that, actually it's two different properties, where my house is and then the open space that belongs to me that goes all the way from Campfire all the way down to the beginning of the, where the ponds and stuff are. So I go all the way down that way. I have an assessment on that, by the way. I have an assessment, and I'm taxed on it as well. So, I'm sitting here thinking, oh, wait a minute, it's zero, but I have an assessment. I'm being taxed on it. So just say that there are different things that are out there that not quite the same.
Karen?
Yeah, I'm really confused by this, I mean, the whole thing where the state of Maryland's going to come in and tax us. Are there examples of that? Examples where an HOA has valued their property and suddenly the state swoops in and charges them taxes? Is there precedent for that?
I mean, there's very few HOAs that are in the position that we have that have 3,600 acres of open space. So the answer to your question is, I don't know of any. I'm just talking about a practical aspect. If you start putting value, I'm just alerting you to the potential danger of doing that. I mean, you could take it for what it's worth, but having worked in government for a long time, if it moves, we'll tax it.
Amen.
Bill and Ellen?
Right, well, I was going to say, just to button, if we wanted to go for a flat 813 a year, getting all the land taxed will be contrary to that. And I was hoping we could move to slide 3.
Yes. So yeah.
Before we do that, I do want to get to Ellen's question.
Yeah, I guess for me, it's this, I get your point, John, and I can accept it. But to me, it's a little bit of a red herring. I guess as a layperson, I'm not sure what the difference is between saying this property over here is said to be worth X amount, so I'm going to use that as the way I'm valuing this property, as versus saying this is what the value of this property is. So I mean, it seems like a hair that's being split. But more importantly to me is the issue for me is I'm not concerned about, BGE needs to go under our pathway to service a pipe that they've got or whatever. That's a limited thing. It's already there. We give them easement to go on our land to do their work and they go away. I am more concerned about, it's not so much about the value of the land, it's about the value that we are giving to a private corporation when such an example happens that accrues to their benefit. Are we getting sufficient benefit from that? It's the same question I was asking 14 years ago around then General Growth saying we want to have 5,000 more housing units in downtown Columbia, and what's the benefit that residents are going to get from this?
So Alan, to get to your point and also address Andy's point, I don't think we're appraising the value of the land itself. We're appraising the use of the land. So, for example, say the NFL want to come in and say we want to host the Super Bowl in the middle of Columbia open space.
But that's why I'm saying this is a red herring issue.
The land is technically zero, but the easement to grant the NFL the use of our open space to host the Super Bowl is certainly not zero.
Exactly.
It would certainly be.
It would make Susan not need those short-term loans.
That's right.
But there also is oftentimes a public good that comes out of the easement, right? So, for instance, if that fiber optic goes through there and Whole Foods can service more residents because of that and provide more product, then that's value to residents. That so it's not as simple, cut and dry.
No,
I'm not saying it is.
I would say, way out of order here, but like when you're talking about that, and I could address Super Bowl too. Social welfare includes all these things, so it's not just dollars. It's, is there social welfare benefit for people coming to Meriwether Post that we're well known throughout the state of Maryland, other places, because we have great concerts and people come to Columbia? Is that a benefit? Now, do we look at dollar for dollar? If we improve the pathway system because we got an easement down at the lakefront and it's a nicer area for people to walk, that's a social welfare benefit. Sure. If we include improved connectivity, that's something. The standard that exists now, that's what you have to decide. And I think the point of this is, and go through quickly, the staff will evaluate these things, brings it to you, it says, this is our recommendation, and then you make the call.
Right, and what we usually don't get, though, is what the expected benefit to the private corporation is and how to value that. So that's a piece that I would like to see moving forward, that we understand better so that we can include that as, we're looking at various sides of a ledger, if you will. Yes, there's the benefit that's going to benefit residents, but if it's going to benefit the corporation this much, there may be other benefits we need, financial and otherwise. One final, I just want, because I wasn't clear on what you, B1A says promotion of the social welfare of the people of Columbia. Is that an okay phrase, or is that too
Well,
limited?
that comes from our.
I know, but is that going to pass the muster of what you were talking about limitation?
Well, I think that means the general public, okay?
It does, okay. So
That's the way I
okay.
would interpret it based on the case.
That's okay, thank you.
Okay, let's see if we can go through. So,
Dennis has one quick question before we get to
So
slide 3.
to Alan's point, if you take a look at that pathway that we grant the easement for, what is the value to Howard Hughes versus the value to CA? I mean, I don't know that, you want us to bring that forward. I'm not sure I could. I mean, is the whole of Lakefront North contingent on that, or is there something else they could do? And they walk away from the pathway, we don't get it at all? I mean, it's such a nuance. In some cases, there's a number, but not in every case.
I hear you.
okay, so let me just go through this. So this the easement review process. We're going through complying with the policy, adhering to the social welfare benefits. As part of our CA team, we directly engage the project team. We provide input on the design, work with the applicant, coordinate with stakeholders until the project is completed. There's extensive interdepartmental cross-review involving the various departments. I mean, legal, open space, capital improvements, sustainability, construction, all these parts of CA are involved in. I mean, we have a meeting every 2 weeks of all these groups. We're on the phone reviewing every project that's open. This is continually happening. So the point I want to say is there's a lot of work that goes into these easements, a lot of background. So who applies for easements? Well, there's residents, government agencies, Howard County, could be the state, developers, utility companies. There's some examples. BGE has perpetual, easements. And quite honestly, based on their easements, they don't have to let us know. They can just go on our property. But because of the situation that's been developed and the relationship with CA, they let us know beforehand, and we work with them. If that were to change, they could just show up, on Monday morning, somewhere very inconvenient, and start digging. But we have this relationship with them where they notify us, but they have an easement where they can just go on the property.
Is there a different process or standard when we're dealing with the county versus dealing with other companies?
It's all standardized.
Yeah, because I noticed in the charter, it breaks out government entities separate from other entities. I was just wondering if there's a different standard that the board should apply or a process that the board should apply. Bill and Karen.
Are you including the school system as part of the government there?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Karen?
Yeah, I had a question about, shoot, I forgot my question. Come back to me, sorry, I completely forgot. I remembered it, I'm sorry, John. So when you're talking about the easement with BG&E, that easement says they can just come on our property whenever, they never have to give us notice.
Right.
Would it be better to have an easement where they had to give us notice?
Yeah, it would be.
So they have eminent domain, so they can go wherever they want based on state law. But we have an agreement with them through this easement process where they've granted us the courtesy of this notification process. So because they're actively, and they want to be good neighbors, right?
Right.
BG wants to be proactive. So we have this process where we get this, basically it's a right of entry to come to our property to do some type of work, some type of maintenance.
Okay, I understand that. So
They're not required to do that by
Right.
law, but because they are good partners in our community, we have this arrangement with them to do it.
Are they an exception? Since they have eminent domain, are they an exception?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I wonder. Thank you.
And just quickly, these are listing up there some types of the requests we get for easements, okay? Utility access, public infrastructure for commercial development, if they need to dig sewer lines, public water lines, land swaps we talked about before, equal value, so that We might swap a piece of property so that we wouldn't have to have a perpetual easement and bind that property forever. It makes sense. Columbia Pathway Network, particularly now around what's developing at the lakefront, and shared parking arrangements. We talked about that around the lakefront again, especially around some of the events.
So those aren't all easements, so number 3 is obviously not.
Well,
Number 3 is obviously not an easement.
Well,
because
yeah,
of swap.
some are not. Some are licenses, but they can be easements. So just give you an example quickly of some of these things in action, just in small, medium, and large. So this first is the Shaw property. This was over in River Hill. This is kind of a smaller project, just to give you an idea. This thing began in October of 2018. The board voted in November of 2018. The easement was finally recorded in October of 2023, and the project is expected to be done next month. That shows you how long, and this was one of the smaller easements. If you're looking, all the land administration, general counsel, capital improvements, office presidents, all involved in the review of this. In terms of the benefits, the social welfare benefits that this brought, that were findings, well, this brought new lien-paying property in Columbia. We annexed some property, so this actually helped the lien payers because we got some more property that we could assess and get some more money.
Okay.
And it also reduced CA's. They agreed to take some of one of our sewer properties, so we don't have to maintain that anymore. So we save money that way. So that's some of the social welfare benefits, an example of how that's done.
So I'm trying to understand this. I get the timeline, I get the point you're making. It occurs to me why, it sounds like what you're saying is this was put in front of the board approved it, and then the analysis happened.
No, well, I mean, you have to.
And that feels backwards to me.
So I was here when this came through, and the reality is we talk about if we can put something under the annual charge, that money is forever. It's not a one-time payment; it's forever. It goes up with inflation, and the same thing in Kings when we did that property there. So we've always talked about that up front, and we've always prioritized putting property under the annual charge, knowing that money is forever.
Okay, but I'm talking more in general about process. The point I'm hearing John make is that these things get put before the board votes, and then the analysis is done.
So there's some
that feels
analysis
backwards to me.
So there's some analysis that is done up front, but the final construction documents are not done and so
That's not the analysis of the benefit. That's not.
Well, the
That's
benefit
the nitty-gritty
analysis
of
would have been the
getting it
discussion at the board meeting where we said the annual charge money is forever.
Was that the only?
Versus a one-time payment of, I want $100,000.
Again, another example. Oops. Try this. This is the building that's going up down at the lakefront now, the South Lake Medical Office Building. This is something that's, went ahead. The start date was December of 2021. The board voted in March of 2021. Easement recorded in January of last year, about a year ago, and it's not projected to be completed until May of this year. This was one that has involved significant legal work. I can tell you it's still ongoing. I mean, we've spent thousands and thousands of dollars. Some of these easements are difficult to negotiate. There are terms. You have to get property surveys, meets and bounds. You're negotiating with the developer about what they can do, what they can't.
So were we reimbursed for all that legal work?
Yeah.
Is under the ancillary expenses?
Was the CA reimbursed for all the legal work we had to do for this easement?
No, not that I.
I think we typically are, but we can confirm that.
Yeah,
It's part of the application process that they have to pay for the entire process.
So we were reimbursed for all the legal work.
I can confirm that for you.
Okay.
Still on, it's also ongoing, it's not done yet. I mean, I could tell you there are bills generated as recently as last month.
Keith? I understand in terms of a construction project developing, but in order to grant the easement, how much work is done before that easement comes to the board? I think that's part of the sort of the discussion or the question that's being asked. Because I get that there's work to be done in order to figure out all the details of how that's going to execute down the road, but do you have a sense of that?
Well, so here's the process, and this is following up on the procedure that's on the website that's in your packet, right? So the first thing that comes in is an application, and typically it involves a meeting with the applicant, going over the submission, making suggestions, maybe negotiating back, this is a better idea, maybe you should do this. So that all that is done up front. And the staff then has to determine, the impact on CA property, that's done beforehand. Whether CA should be named as an additional owner of the property and the development plans. Looking at the community benefits, the staff assesses that. What does it promote the social welfare? Is an easement really necessary, or can an alternative design be used? All those things are decided by the staff.
So I think part of when you're talking about the project timelines, when I heard you talk about it, I got a little bit concerned because it sounded like, okay, the project started, a month later it's going to the board for an easement, and then there's a long process before that. But I think there's a lot of work.
There's a lot of work that goes
to that.
Before it goes to the board. The staff has to do all this work to get it ready for you,
right.
Because there's forms that are filled out, and specifically laid out is the social welfare benefit, and it will say, this is going to improve connectivity, this is going to improve the pathway system, so that you can make findings. This is what the staff has found in the background. Now, once the easement is approved, there are still development plans because construction changes. There's a lot of work to be done afterward, but there is a lot of work done up front before it gets to you.
And can I ask just one follow-on to that?
Sure.
When we write easements, do we I'll call it an out clause? For instance, if after 2 years worth of construction workup and documentation, we don't feel comfortable with what's happening, is that typically written into easements in any fashion?
We'd have to get back to you on the details of that. But
Okay.
typically, the process is so significant around the foundational aspects of the viability of the project. Typically, easements cannot be revoked, right? There's financing, there's other things like that that go into play around making a successful project.
Okay.
But we can confirm some of those details later.
Karen?
Yeah, so when you're doing the analysis around social welfare, what goes into that analysis?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we have to do is look at what the benefits are. I mean, is it going to improve the pathway system? Are we going to get a new sewer system? Is it going to improve connectivity of the paths or, internet access? Will it be good for economic development in Columbia? Is it going to serve the resident? I mean, there are all these various aspects that are questions that are asked and that are put out there.
Right, but I guess I really want to know is, and let me ask this too, is that at what point do we involve the residents? At what point are the residents told, this is going to come, we think this is a benefit to the residents, this is what we're doing, and we get resident input on whether it's actually a benefit. Because I know everybody loves Merriweather. I went to Merriweather concerts, but there's a lot of people who complain about Merriweather because it's too loud. They don't actually see it as a benefit because it's in their backyard and it's too loud, and they can't sit out on summer nights because they don't want to enjoy that music. So it's not always a social benefit to everybody. So I really want to know what goes into that analysis to show that for the majority of the residents in Columbia, it's a social benefit. Or are we just serving I want to make sure we're not just serving a small piece, because Whole Foods is a lovely place. I'm glad we've got connectivity down there. I think that's great. Can I use that connectivity when I'm outside of Whole Foods? Because Whole Foods tends to be a little bit pricey. Not everybody can afford to go into Whole Foods. So I want to know, when we say that it's social welfare, when it's serving the whole community, is it actually serving the whole community, or is it just serving a portion of the community?
Actually, I've got a sort of follow-up question to that. So getting back to the welfare of the people of Columbia, and you say it's broader than the residents, and then Dennis brings up the point that, okay, these properties will add to the annual charge, but properties adding to the annual charge, that just goes into CA's revenue stream, so that's just benefiting the residents. So I feel a disconnect.
The residents, because we have a lot of non-residents who use our property. A lot of people come from outside of Columbia to use the property. It's not just the residents who benefit from the annual charge.
Sky?
Yeah, it sounds like there are tangible things and intangibles, and it's hard to put a number, a monetary value on the intangibles because it varies from person to person. So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we have to find the greatest good for the most people. And that's certainly not everybody, and it may not be the people across the street from Meriwether who are can't be outside in the summertime because of concerts. But in a way, it's comparing apples and oranges, and you can't compare them. But I think you can set a monetary value as a baseline, and that's objective, and the intangibles are subjective, and you kind of have to go with your gut. I don't know.
Eric?
So just real quick.
Dennis,
So in many cases, the easements. In many cases, thank you. The easements that are on the property came with the property. So it's not the fact that we gave Meriwether an easement that allowed them to have the concert. That just came with that was part of the deal of taking the property. And with 600 and some easements, I bet that 300 of them are older, predate all of us here in terms of being part of that process. The other thing I'd like to say is that in some cases, when we have talked to applicants, we haven't agreed. And I've said, look, you can, staff is going to recommend against this. It's your decision whether or not you bring it to the board. And they have in some cases. For instance, the Kings, they brought it to the board, and I think I was being unreasonable by requiring the annual charge. And the boards, said, no, that's reasonable. And it's happened on more than one occasion. So we're always looking out for the best interests of the Columbia Association, what adds value. And it's not always an easy process.
Bill?
I think when you get to the question of what is the social benefit of any particular easement, it is a blank slate that you start with every single application, and you have to apply and look at what this does. I mean, for the South Medical Center that was up there just a minute ago, you look at that and you say, well, what is the social benefit of that? You've got thousands of square feet of medical office space, which will allow people to see more doctors, be healthier, get better service. You're going to have additional parking. You're going to have better connectivity to the pathways. They're going to have entertainment there. These are all social benefits that could be possibly weighed as part of this easement. That is that particular easement. How does that actually translate to a land swap next to the legacy on Cedar Lane that we did earlier this year? That was a walking path swap, which would have better facilitated people walking next to that new enterprise development, and that made a lot of sense. These are all, there's no, these are the social benefits for every single easement. They all have to be judged individually. And we need to be cognizant of that. There is no special magic formula to say it's always this. We need to take a look and say, what is and isn't.
Okay. How many more slides do you have?
We're almost done. The point was made about residents that Karen was talking about. We have a slide now about notifications. So the initial phase one is the village is contacted, before presenting to CA's board of directors to let them know that this easement isn't work. Then the later phases, the village is contacted before construction, residents immediately affected get notification. These notifications are also sometimes or usually made by a parallel government agency. So that, Howard County has their also notifications. There's forms with from the CA Real Estate Services website. So those are some of the notifications that are going on.
Karen?
Yeah, so John, what you're saying is the residents aren't included until after we've already approved the easement and the construction has started?
No,
it's before.
Alan?
Can you go
I
back?
just said that before you get presented to the board, the CA villages are notified. Now, whether they decide not to notify the residents, I don't know.
Okay.
but-
We have two public meetings on it.
Can I have one more follow-up? John, your presentation was very good. Thank you very much for putting all this together. But it's not in our packet. I mean, can we get a copy of this presentation?
It'll be on the website.
No.
It's not in the packet.
It's on the packet, so it needs to be sent out.
I mean, we can, I don't know, we could send it out,
Yeah.
I mean, we can do that. I mean, there are more slides, but
Alan?
we're out of
Yeah,
time.
I know. My notes.
I'll be happy to.
Thank you.
Three things. Going back to Karen's point, I want to make sure I'm understanding you properly. Villages get notified. I assume that means village managers get notified. Is that correct?
I think typically there's actually a presentation to the village board.
Say again?
I think typically there's a presentation to the village board.
For every easement? I don't recall. I've been on the Harper's Choice Village Board ex officio for 10 years. I don't recall CA ever coming to the village to talk about an upcoming easement. So either that means there have been no easements in Harper's Choice, or I was absent those times, or it doesn't happen. So I want to make sure that that's followed through, and I know.
Confirm the process.
So if I need to ping our village manager to say, hey, when you get notified, I want you to notify the board, that's one thing. Second thing, just for your information, my understanding is most of the people who complain about Merriweather noise are not next door neighbors. Some of them live as far away as Ellicott City or other parts of downtown Columbia, but that's a whole different matter. This may be too large a question for right now, but it's the elephant in the room. The easement that most typifies, perhaps, and has sort of been the springboard for this discussion and this concern about easements is the WSSI easement. I'm having trouble putting this whole process into the 11-minute discussion that I was part of, that we had to approve that easement. I'm having trouble that we allowed it, or we weren't given the right information, all the information, or you all didn't have it. This feels like way too much stuff for us to have squeezed into 11 minutes of discussion on that easement. So I guess what I'd like to know is, what are the staff's lessons learned about that easement process to inform us as we go forward?
Reg?
I'm sorry?
I think everything we do as staff is evolutionary. I believe that almost everything we do as staff is evolutionary.
Okay.
And certainly that easement has been the subject of a lot of discussion.
So what are some of the things that we've learned?
So we do a better job with door hangers, for instance, and we're more intentional about those kinds of things. And I know that I've talked to staff about making sure we contact the village board on everything. And so we're much more intentional about reaching out but it's certainly.
How about in terms of what's brought to the board for the board to consider and discuss? I was part of it, so I'm putting myself in the bucket.
So I look, and I was here then at that time as well, and it's hard for me to remember the 11 minutes. But with that being said, when we brought the MOB, the medical office building easement forward, that wasn't a 2-hour discussion, but that's actually all the easements are a pretty big deal because you're giving up the property in perpetuity for a certain use. But the discussion in here may not be seem lengthy, but staff has spent a lot of time in the background thinking about what the ramifications are, how can we argued, but I've had so many discussions with Howard Hughes about the orientation of pathways and the grade around the pathway, and I'm not doing this or you're not doing that there is a lot of time that your staff spends on these things before they ever get here.
Karen?
Yeah, I think staff does put a lot of time into these, and I appreciate that. Oh, Rich, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I saw Karen's hand, I saw Reg's hand, sorry.
So I just want to say, I appreciate all the work. One of the things that really concerns me is we don't get independent experts to weigh in. And when we talked about WSSI, a lot of the stuff that came up was, we're not experts. Staff said they were not experts. We didn't have experts. The only expert we were relying on was WSSI. And I think that puts us in a position of risk. And so in that particular instance, I think that's where we wanted to have that outside expert come in and validate what we were going to do, or say, don't do this. This is a bad idea. Here's what you're going to experience. So I think that's what was missing in that particular instance. I think in some others, I won't go into details now because it's late, but I think in others, I think we do need to have appraisals of the property. And I'll just reiterate what Alan said earlier. It's a red herring to say we can't value our property when we're going to go into negotiations for a contract. So.
Reg, sorry, I saw Karen's hand first, so.
Sorry, Reg, thank you.
Reg. You got the floor, Reg.
All right, I have two questions. First one is, you mentioned that, that we make sure the residents are notified. How do we, in what fashion are they notified? Does anyone know, do we know how the residents are contacted and say, hey, this is going to be projects going forward? And I have another question after that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I just got clarification. The process is the applicant is required to notify the village managers of the easement that's being applied for.
Mm-hmm.
The applicant.
But what about the residents?
Then it's up to the village to do it.
Yeah,
So the applicant has to notify the village.
that's our process currently.
Okay, so my second question is, if the board decides that, we're not going to pass this, we don't like this easement, we're not going to pass it, what happens from there? Because obviously, the company, the firms that are doing the construction, whatever it may be, they've already started the process, spent the money, getting themselves all geared up and ready to go. What happens from there?
Well, if they don't get the required permission, then they,
Well, we had a discussion about this today. In many cases, it goes back to the money. And the funders, whoever it is, Chase, Manhattan Bank, requires all of these parts to be in place before they'll give you the money to execute your project. So in many cases, it's part of the investment application that they have all these pieces in place. So it wouldn't move forward without easements.
So without the easements, it's not going, chances are not going forward.
And then just in terms of statistics, so in general, we execute about 75 leases a year for events on our property. There's about 30 rights of entry that are processed every year in terms of people needing to traverse open space to get somewhere else to do some type of work, again, typically BGE. And then anywhere from 10 to 12 easements a year. So it can be one per village on average per year. And most of them are in town center, right? It's where the development's happening, or something that's not very exciting, like a sewer line in River Hill, right? So in many cases, they're very simplistic, rudimentary infrastructure type projects, like a sidewalk or road for access or sewer system.
Thank you.
Bill, then Keith, and then I'd like to try to wrap this up, if that's okay.
Yeah, with a nod towards trying to wrap this up, I'm going to kind of Bobby Brown new edition you guys here for a minute.
Do you need a backbeat?
No, I'll be all right. This just every little step I take here. It's just want to let you know, I spent about a decade on both the planning board and the Board of Appeals combined. And I find that the decision-making processes that were inherent in those boards is very similar to easement decision-makings that we need to do here. Most of the decisions done by the CA board are not like easements. Budget decisions on programs and services, it's a much different decision-making process. I think everybody on this board would be great planning board or Board of Appeals members. And I think we ought to look at how they actually make decisions, how they set up those boards so that they can make good decisions. You know, there is typically a technical staff report that's published by the county staff for the board prior to hearing the particular stuff. There's clearly established criteria for the board to evaluate whatever plan is before them to ensure that an outcome meets those criteria. There is more of a deliberative process, an applicant and an opposition, whereas we use Robert's rules and kind of go round the horn a couple of times. We really ought to look at how we look at, the applications and maybe mimic some of those structures when doing easements, because I think we'd get better outcomes. I think that a lot of the things we're worried about here are inherent in kind of the structure that we use in our approach. And if we took a few minutes to look at it, I think we may find that we could, make better decisions in a faster way than what we're currently looking at.
Keith?
And then one last thing. We've been talking about 600 some odd easements that have been developed over 50 years, probably more of them because some of them have expired. And we're talking about a handful that have been very upsetting in the community. And I think that actually, while improving easements is very important, I think we ought to just call the question and just have a discussion on whether or not we should do stream restoration and be honest with our residents and the community about that. And come up with a better easement procedure, because I think that if we're going to work through this process and go with much longer processes, more delays, more cost for school system easements or utility easements, it's just going to not be good for this community. In order to ensure that some stream restoration easement is not executed in the same way we have done in the past. So I'd like to separate the two of these and go forward. I'm just going to leave it at that and let the board take that.
Keith? Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is, we always hammer that prior board that made the decision, but I would suspect that there was discussion about the social welfare at that time. The question is did it meet now that we know all of this other information, did it meet the standard anymore? And I think, I thought you were going to tell me my mic. So I think we need to keep that in mind, as we can always look back and start to question some things. So what are the things that we've learned, both from a staff standpoint in terms of what that decision-making was? But what I never hear ever on this board is what is the board learned about the types of decisions and the thought process that we need to go through to evaluate these things. Because if there is all of this work that's done up front and we want to see more on certain types of things, I think we need to ask for it, right? That becomes the standard, because if the work's being done, we need to pull out the policy, for instance, and say, okay, on every easement, we want to ask these questions and hold ourselves accountable to something. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't problems with the existing process policy, and we can probably tighten all those pieces up, but I think we need to ask ourselves, how is the board being held accountable for asking the types of questions that we've established that we want to have done? Because I've learned a lot today in terms of what's there, and it doesn't feel like we always ask the details of some of these projects.
Andy, then I'd like to wrap this segment up.
Yeah, actually wanted to address Alan's little question, because you and I were both on the board. The problem was, the decision was the 11 minutes, but it did not capture the year-long discussions that occurred. It started all the way back with when we gave the easement to the state. And then we had more discussions on that. And then we told staff to go out and look for a different type, a contract. So we had those discussions. What you saw January was the culmination of a bunch of stuff that occurred. And so, it is really unfair to say, oh, wow, they only took 11 minutes to do it. Well, the answer is, yeah, it only took 11 minutes to do it because we told staff to go out and get a contract. Staff went out and got a contract. We knew all that. Okay, and so I do have a problem. And I agree with Keith. It's more on the board, okay, and how we process things. But I don't want to think, people have this idea that it was just a flippant 11-minute decision, and it wasn't. It was the culmination of a whole lot of discussions that had occurred over several years, Okay, and so by the time you got to where it said, oh, well, they need an easement to do the work, it was like, well, of course, we've spent all this time, we've spent all this discussion, we've spent all this effort. Sure, we'll give an easement. I mean, because it was all that background stuff. Okay, so that's why, you're right, Alan. I mean, it wasn't like that's where it came out and it showed up, but it doesn't show all the other stuff that went into it.
Alan, do you have 30 seconds?
Yeah. Yes, and.
Yeah.
Because there were people on the board then who weren't on the board before.
Right.
And all that.
Yes.
And I get your point, Keith. One of the catch-22s is we don't always know what we're supposed to ask for, and that's where we need to have that symbiotic relationship with the staff to help guide us in what questions we do need to ask, because we don't always know. Yep. There was for that one, the social benefit was easy. We're going to get $10 million worth of work on our streams for free. Oh, boy. There was no need for a lot of discussion. Right. It's just all the stuff we didn't know. My final point, and I don't want a response from you right now, Dennis. You know I have enormous respect for you. Your response to my question that we've improved door knockers was not satisfactory to me. I don't need a response right now, but I would like us, and if it requires a discussion with the board as well, so it encompasses what Keith is talking about, what does the board need to learn? I think we need to do a lessons learned from that experience so we can move forward more intelligently.
So John, I'd like to wrap this up. Are there any key points that we're missing? I know we didn't get through all your slides.
I mean, I can't say we did it logically or in order, but.
Wait a minute, there was one thing that John did, I mean, and I don't know if you have it, but ending easements. Does you have anything on how easements get ended, or if they do?
Well, perpetual, they don't. I mean,
they don't, okay.
You can have an easement expire by its terms, you can make it for a limited time. I mean, you can do that. I mean, typically, if you're going to do a development project, right, they're not going to do a development and get it done for 2 years or whatever. So it really depends on what you negotiate and the extent of it.
Jeremy has
one quick 10 seconds.
An example, we put a reversionary clause in that fiber optic thing. If it's not used for that purpose, it goes away. So there is a way to end them.
So I'd like to.
Jeremy has.
Just real quick, so a lot of this information is public. It's on our real estate services website. So the process, the application form, it's all there if you have time. It's sort of it's still into this presentation, but all the details and the exact steps that individuals have to take to get an easement are on our website as public information.
Okay, so that more than ends this allotted time for this agenda item. I'd like to see this presentation sent out to the public and sent out to the board. So either post on the website and also sent out to the board so we have copies of it. One quick note is, like, at the end of the day, the approval for these easements rests with the board. It's our decision. This isn't something where you can take an easement, pipe it through some computer algorithm and get a yes/no response. We've got to use the information that we've got and use that to make a decision. And it's a qualitative decision. It's not a objective necessarily yes/no. It's like you have to use your own judgment. It's really a judgment decision that we have to make. That being said, it's our responsibility when we're making a judgment decision to get all the information that we can get and make sure that we have all the relevant information to make our best judgments. With that, I will go to questions only. Are there any questions only for state and county legislation?
Can I just ask another question or comment about this? The policy that's been circulating all over the place. I think one of the things that we discussed is that has to be evaluated in some fashion. So I think that there's an opportunity to take a look at the existing policy and what we've discussed today and what we potentially have learned, lessons learned, whatever. Take a look at what the work that's been put into the new policy and figure out what things we need to improve or change. And I'd like.
That's why we have 3 meetings to make all policy. Make all policy changes,
and so on and so forth. But we've never said that at the board that that's something that we want to have done. And I'm just stating that I'd like to have that done to be evaluated against, given the information that we have, to be evaluated.
So the next step is to take the next step is for the BOC to take this policy and put it on the agendas. So basically, the previous BOC has the agendas all the way through February, which is just one more meeting after this. The next BOC, I believe, meets probably the last week in February or sometime around then. And it would be, the next BOC will have the decision to set the agendas for March and April. So I believe our recommendation to that BOC would be to add this on the agenda for the new easement policy on the agenda for March and April.
That's separate from what I'm asking for, but.
That was what you're asking for.
No, he's asking, can we go ahead and evaluate the policy I submitted? I mean, it's a working session, so I wasn't sure if we could make a motion, or did we need to vote on it or anything, so.
No vote.
I don't think we can.
Evaluate the policy as submitted.
The proposed policy that I submitted, that's what Keith's saying, let's evaluate.
So when we circulated the policy has been circulating around to everyone, and one of the comments that I made is that, hey, I'd like for staff to take a look at this through staff's lens, to take a look at the legal aspect, so on and so forth. And then now that we've had all these conversations, it seems like it makes sense to take a look at our current policy, to evaluate it against what we're seeing in this new policy, plus lessons learned, and then come back with something that we may or may not discuss, but at least we get work done.
And that's the way ahead for staff. That's the way ahead for staff to evaluate the proposed policy. At the same time, the BOC does set the agendas for March and April, so it'd be the BOC's responsibility to put that on the agenda for March and April, and then as a board, we would be able to have a work session to discuss exactly that.
I think it's way premature to talk about the new policy. I think we should take the ideas in it and compare them with the current policy to find out what's missing in our current policy, if anything,
That's what I said.
before we write a new policy. And we would not write it. That would be micromanaging the staff. The staff would write it based upon what we think the changes should be.
The board sets the policy.
So the board sets policy, staff has the policy.
I understand. The board would give ideas to the staff. The staff would do the writing of the policy.
We agree. We totally agree, and that's what I was asking for.
The staff has the ideas. They've got the draft policy. I assume they'll come back with recommendations, and then it's for the board to discuss in work session.
No, I disagree. I think that's premature. We have our starting ground is the current policy. We should decide whether or not there are holes in it.
That's a decision for the BOC. The BOC sets the agenda. Can we, and it's 10:15. We're going on to questions only.
Bill has his hand up.
Eric?
10 seconds.
Eric, I'll tell you what. We ought to have general counsel look at this policy and make sure that it works before it starts getting out to the public, which apparently it already has. I mean, we got to make sure that it actually will pass muster and be executable before it gets out to the general counsel,
I believe, has the policy, or at least it should.
From staff's perspective, we'd like the board to weigh in before we commit staff resources to review the policy. If every single board member had their own policy, we'd be reviewing 10 individual policies, which we don't want to do when we don't have time. And I don't even know how long it's going to take to do whether that can be on the agenda in March and April, because that's another question. This is not a decision that you make in 10 minutes, right? This is a long, thought-out process. And so we would like the board to weigh in. We want to review the policy we have. Are there improvements that can be made? Certainly we'll read that, but we wouldn't do as thorough a review unless the board as a body wants staff to commit resources to that, and then we'll have to figure out how long it's going to take. It's not as if we were sitting around waiting for something to do, right? It's going to take time.
That's what the request is. So we're going round and round a little bit here, but the request is to take a look, from my standpoint, unless you disagree, Karen, because you brought it forward on some levels, is to take a look at our existing policy, our conversation today, and to take a look at the opportunities that exist within the new policy, because there's some things that people were looking for or asking for from the public, and see where we can augment and improve that. And in terms of the policy, I hear you also in terms of, it's been circulated around, but I believe that this is homegrown. This is from the residents and it's come through Karen, but I believe the reason why it's circulated around is because a lot of people are concerned about this, and we need to take those those thoughts into account. The slight difference between my opinion on the policy is that I would prefer, rather than having written a policy, that we have a list of things that are problematic and then incorporate that into it. But either way, we have a policy/list, and we just need to compare them and figure out where the gaps are.
So are there any objections with staff, which shall include the general counsel among others, review the proposed policy compared to our current policy, come back to the board with recommendations, and that the board can take those recommendations and deliberate of those in work session? Are there any objections to that course of action? Alan?
I'm not sure I have an objection because I'm not sure I fully understand what you're proposing, but my thought is that we've had, although we had a chance certainly to ask questions of the staff today, we really haven't had a discussion among ourselves of what we each think about the shortcomings and advantages of our current policy. So it seems to me the next step is for us to decide, and we have Karen's proposal, so we have some ideas, is for us to have that discussion so that we can then task staff.
I sure hope we're not doing that tonight.
No, I'm not saying to do it tonight. I'd like that to be on the agenda as the next step before we ask the staff to dig in.
So that I believe is a work session topic also. It's all part of the same thing. I mean, and there'll be certainly a need for another work session topic on this.
What I'm saying is I don't see any need to task staff to look at the legality of specific elements of Karen's proposal before we decide what of those elements we think we'd like to move forward with. That seems like extra work for the staff that we don't necessarily need.
And our proposal isn't that long. Andy?
I agree with Alan. I know.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, I know, wow, it's getting late, I guess.
It's a big one.
But you're right, I mean, we had a lot of good information presented tonight, but the board never really got to sit around and discuss. And I really think that's the next thing before you start tasking staff, because I'd rather have staff hear what the board's talking about and thinking about, and then they can go back and do whatever.
We just had an hour-and-a-half conversation on this.
No, we didn't. We had a presentation, but we have not really discussed it.
We literally had an hour-and-a-half discussion on this.
On the topic, but
on the topic,
on a staff.
which went into all kinds of details. I mean, we've already had an hour-and-a-half discussion on this. And I would really like to move on to questions only because it is 10:30.
But we need to resolve what we're doing from here.
Yes. So again, I think we've got an easement policy out there, proposed.
Thank you.
Staff has a copy of it. It's what, a one-page policy?
It is a couple pages.
Couple pages, two-page policy?
It's not a huge policy, but it is a couple pages.
It's not the longest thing in the world. Right. I mean, it's not like the ethics policy that went on forever.
Right.
I think for us to take the time to go through it right now, which we don't even have a copy of in the packet, to say, okay, we like this, we don't like that, that's already getting into discussion.
I did want it to be included in the packet, just for the record.
I get it, but it's not. And we don't have the time right now at 10:30 to go through that policy right now because it is 10:30. I think if we're going to actually have some efficiency with this, I think it makes sense for staff to just take a look at it and make some comments on it and come back to the board, and so the board can look at their comments, look at the proposed policy, look at the existing policy, and have a discussion around that. If you have additional comments, additional things that you want to see, feel free to raise them, and then we can include those also. But I think right now, I think we're just spinning our wheels.
So what's your time frame? Are you talking about the first meeting in March?
That would be up for the BOC to figure out, so that the BOC can determine how to schedule that. But March it really depends on schedules. Okay.
Just for the record, I disagree that I'm not asking the staff to evaluate the policy as it stands. That wasn't what I said.
Yeah, I understand. That being said, can we go into questions only? Does anybody have any questions on the state county legislation?
Did we solve that? I'm great with you being the chair, but I just
staff charged with doing it or not?
So
what's the vote of the board? Or what's the sense?
Do people? Okay, sense of the board. everybody raise your hand if you want staff to evaluate Karen's policy and come back to the board with recommendations. Is that a fair statement? Okay.
Question? Oh, you can't.
Just sense of the board. It's not a vote, just sense of the board.
Just a sense of the board.
Sense of the board. Who would like to see staff look at that? So I got 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're sort of split-ish. And who doesn't want staff to look at it?
Chris has, did you get Chris's hand?
I got Chris's hand.
That was part of the 4.
And I got 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's like split. So might as well have staff look at it.
No.
No,
Well, I mean,
That is not go with the affirmative there. Let's-
It's not a motion.
In my rule, 4 is a tie.
Still,
Dennis, well,
It's not a motion.
Have the staff look
in
at it.
your sense, what's reasonable for the staff to do at this point? Given what you heard for the hour and a
Can
half?
we go back and look at it and sit down and talk about it? Because we did not have the time to go through that revise. Let us go back and look at it and let you know.
That's exactly what we proposed.
No, you asked me to do a
No.
review. No, you want me to do a review. I'm telling you, I'm going to look at it and tell you what I can do.
You're missing words on the review.
No.
Look at it.
You use the word review, and that's staff time, and that's the legal thing. This is Dennis just
Andy,
going back and
Andy,
talking with
it's
the staff.
10:30. I trust Dennis is going to take it, review, look at it, whatever word you want to use. I'm running out of dictionary words,
Okay.
and they'll get back to us. Is that fair?
To Dennis.
Yes. Any questions only at 10? Alan,
Yes. John,
you got 5 seconds.
at the last meeting and maybe one before, I registered my concern that we all too often get blindsided by deadlines at the Assembly, General Assembly, and even within the council for us to weigh in on things. And either you were quiet on that or you said, yes, we will do that. At our village board just Tuesday, we had to ram through I'll call it it wasn't like a drastic emergency, but we had to have a discussion and come to a conclusion so that we could write a letter in response to a Terry Hills bill about voting that was going to come up like the next day. So we had to get it in there by 8 in the morning.
Right.
How is it that we at this board were not notified of this so that we could have a similar discussion and weigh in if we felt it was appropriate?
Well, I'm glad you raised that, because this is a perfect example of working behind the scenes and not acting too soon. The fact is that yesterday, it was today actually, the delegation decided on the Terry Hill bill to essentially kill the second and third parts, which were, first of all, there's no direct effect of CA on the village green. So that's one reason it wasn't brought up. Okay, there was no reason to do it unless you wanted to take a
Okay,
position.
that's a very corporate view of it, and I get
Well,
that that's
I mean,
your view of it, but in terms of impact on the residents of Columbia and our constituents, therefore, it's a huge effect.
Well, what we said was, it would, look, if you wanted to weigh in and say, my position is, if I thought that you should take an action, we would have said so. We didn't think it was appropriate at that time for the board to take an action, and I think that proved to be the case because the bill, in the form that it was, didn't go ahead. And frankly, we had worked with Delegate Hill, and CA was not part of the bill because we had done a lot of the work out front to exempt us from it. I understand the village, they had an interest because it directly affected them, but we had worked beforehand so that it wouldn't affect us. So the fact is the bill was never introduced in its current form. There was no reason to take a position. And that's part of the lobbying that we pay these lobbyists for. We get advice. There's a lot of work going behind the scenes, and sometimes it doesn't make sense to commit to something if we don't have to. And that's the rationale. And Alan, quite frankly, that's the reason the summary is here. If something strikes the board in reading these summaries, and the board decides, I don't like this, let us know and speak up. But if we don't think it's necessary for the board to take a position, we say we're going to continue to monitor, we'll say that. If we think it's an emergency and the board will take, we will immediately bring it to your attention. But in this case, we didn't think so, and I think it has worked out exactly the way we anticipated
Okay.
because of what we did.
I'm glad you did, and I'm glad it worked out, and that was not a foregone conclusion. And one of the aspects of our strategic plan is to be advocates. So my belief, and I'm speaking for Al, and if other board members want to weigh in, they can say what their interpretation is. But my recollection of when we put that together in our strategic plan was that we wanted to be more proactive around our advocacy. And this was an example where it may have worked out. We had an opportunity to be advocates for the whole community, for the whole election process, and whatever else that bill touched on. And we didn't. And so I am individually, I don't have any sway over you, I am individually asking that you take a more proactive view of
So you
thinking
want
about
us
what we might be
to weigh in on
interested in.
every bill and make a recommendation as to what you should, I think.
I want you to be more proactive and thinking.
What does that mean?
It means thinking about.
Alan.
He asked a question.
Yes, but.
It means paying attention to what the board has said we're interested in and erring on the side, not every bill, but erring on the side of raising a bill to say we wonder if you have a thought about this, rather than just having it in a list where we are not the experts, we don't dig into those details in the same way. I'm speaking for me, that's what I would like.
So I think we need to be careful with board, because it's not, if the board felt differently about the list, then I would think we would be going back, but I don't know that the board felt that something that's not directly related to CA, as was outlined, was something that, to be discussed, but.
Karen?
Yeah, I think one of the failings here is we don't have a process for anything. Like, there's no process for like John, I mean, I feel sorry, I'm sorry, John. I mean, I agree with Alan. We do want to be more proactive. I'm sorry that this is stressing you out. I know that we're not easy sometimes to deal with. But I feel like we don't have processes for so many things, for how we do things. And it just feels like, John has these bills coming up, and having worked in the division that had to deal with mandates in the healthcare industry, they come fast and furious. And we were, during the legislative season, we had to meet every single day to talk through these bills and how they impacted the company that I work for. And it's really hard to stay on top of all of them. So there needs to be a better process for the board if we want to weigh in. We need something that says, because otherwise we have to call the paramedics. John is about to have a heart attack
Like a process for creating processes?
What's that?
Like having a process to create processes?
No, I don't want a process to create processes, but
isn't it just reading the, I mean, truly, isn't it
Right.
reading the packet?
Anyway,
Because we got an
anyway,
explanation.
can we keep the questions to the legislation?
Just related to that, I think that if we're going to do advocacy, that's on us, that's on board members. The Terry Hill bill, or the bill that Delegate Hill had proposed, has been known for a while. And this board, if it wanted to advocate, should have, in itself, board members said, let us advocate on a particular position on this bill. We should not be pointing and saying, John, you need to lead us on the advocacy portion here. We should be doing it ourselves. This is crazy to sit here and, I'm sorry, not crazy.
By ourselves, you mean ourselves. By ourselves, you mean the board, not individual members.
Amongst the board members to decide whether to advocate for something or not. We should not be asking.
We don't know dates. Things are coming up for a discussion.
Terry Hill has visited us at least twice to discuss the aspects of this bill, and we could have sat down and said, we will take a position on this bill. We never did, and now at this date, we're saying we should have known more. No, we knew plenty. If we wanted to advocate, we should have advocated a long time.
Right now, it's 10:30, and we're complaining over stuff that's already happened, and we can't really do much about at this point. So, given where we are now at 10:30, are there any more questions on legislation? Andy?
Just some news, because I looked, the Lakefront Improvement Project was approved by the delegation.
Okay.
It's the bands shut down, so good news.
Okay. Any other questions? No questions.
I guess I have a question. I just, for the chair, I just would like to, it's not a statement, I'll phrase it as a question.
Sure.
Jeopardy question here, something. But I'll make my statement. I'm just hoping that the urgency at the end of this meeting, because you're done with some of our conversation, translates to some of the other topics into the future.
Like what topics?
We have to be consistent. When we want to have a conversation, we need to have a conversation. If you're done having the conversation, that doesn't mean the rest of us are done having a conversation.
I understand, but at some point, the alarm goes off. And at some point, the conversation's gone off the rails, which I think has gone off the rails about a while ago. I'm trying to be as consistent as possible. It's a judgment call. That brings us to chair remarks. It's 10:30. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
I'll move to adjourn.
Karen, second by Dennis. Are there any objections to adjourning? Seeing none, meeting is adjourned at 10:30.